When El Serpiente cartel's hitmen arrive to eliminate the only witness to their leader's crimes, they find something unexpected. A silver-haired neighbor with a worn badge in his drawer and 30 years of manhunting in his blood. For Ricardo Vega's killers, this should have been a simple execution. Now, trapped between cartel enforcers and a retired marshal who never lost his prey, the quiet suburbs of San Antonio are about to witness why some lawmen never truly retire. But before we jump back into the video, let us know where you're watching from. And if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe because I have something really special for you tomorrow. And now, back to the video. The black SUV rolled down Sycamore Lane at exactly 2:17 a.m., its headlights off, tires crushing fallen leaves with barely a whisper. 3 men inside, faces expressionless, weapons checked and ready. The mission was simple. House number 1742, second bedroom on the left, 1 target. No witnesses, no complications. Miguel El Gato Reyes, the driver, had done this 17 times before. A quick in-and-out job, the kind El Serpiente cartel paid premium rates for when someone had seen too much. Tonight's target, Elena Morales, a cleaning woman who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time at one of the cartel's money-counting houses. Now she was the prosecution's star witness, hidden away in this quiet San Antonio suburb under a false name while awaiting trial. "We're here," Miguel whispered, killing the engine in front of a modest single-story house with blue trim. Remember, quiet and clean. Ortiz says the woman sleeps alone. No alarm system, basic locks. Julio, the youngest of the 3, checked his high silencer one last time. "What about neighbors? Old people and families?" "Nobody's going to hear a thing," Miguel replied, his voice carrying the bored confidence of routine. "We're ghosts, in and out in 3 minutes. The 3 men exited the vehicle silently, moved across the lawn with practiced precision. Miguel signaled toward the back door, their entry point. As they rounded the corner of the house, a motion sensor, light suddenly flooded the backyard with harsh brightness. "Shit!" hissed Julio, instinctively pressing against the wall. Miguel raised a hand. "Relax, nobody's watching at this hour." They approached the back door, and Carlos, the lock specialist, went to work. 30 seconds later, they were inside the wee kitchen. The house was silent, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant tick of a clock. Miguel drew his pistol, leading the way down the hallway toward where Elena Morales should be sleeping, completely unaware these were her final moments. The men moved like shadows, each step calculated, each breath controlled. As they approached the door to Elena's bedroom, Miguel suddenly stopped, raising his fist in a silent command. Something wasn't right. "You hear that?" he whispered. Carlos shook his head, but then froze. A faint, barely perceptible sound came from somewhere behind them. The subtle click of metal against metal. "You boys picked the wrong house to visit at this hour." The voice came from the darkness at the end of the hallway, calm, measured, with a slight Texas drawl. Before they could react, a flashlight beam hit them directly in the eyes, temporarily blinding them. "Federal Marshal Service," the voice continued. "I'd suggest putting those weapons down real slow-like." When the spots cleared from Miguel's vision, he saw an older man standing there. Silver-haired, weathered face, probably in his 60s, wearing a bathrobe over pajama pants. But what caught Miguel's attention wasn't the man's age or casual attire. It was the absolute stillness with which he held the service weapon pointed at them, the kind of stillness that only comes from decades of experience. "You made 3 mistakes," the old man said, his voice carrying the weight of authority that hadn't diminished with retirement. "First, you hit my motion sensors. Second, you woke me up. Third," he smiled slightly, a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes, "you came after someone under my protection." Miguel calculated the odds. 3 armed men versus 1 old lawman. He should have felt confident, but something in the man's eyes made him hesitate. "You don't understand who you're messing with, viejo," Miguel growled, keeping his gun steady. "Oh, I understand exactly who I'm dealing with," the man replied. "Question is, do you?" Name's Frank Castillo. 32 years with the Marshals, 16 of those hunting cartel runners across 3 countries. Now why don't you tell El Serpiente that Elena Morales is off limits? That's assuming, of course, you gentlemen will be in any condition to deliver messages after tonight. A tense silence filled the hallway as both sides measured each other. Miguel could feel sweat forming on his brow. This was supposed to be simple. This old man wasn't in any of their intelligence briefings. From somewhere in the house came the sound of movement, a door opening, a frightened voice. "Marshal Castillo, is everything okay?" "Stay in your room, Elena," Frank called out, never taking his eyes off the intruders. "We have some uninvited guests, but they were just leaving." Miguel's mind raced through options, none of them good. What had started as a routine hit was quickly spiraling into something much more complicated. The old Marshal stood there like a wall between them and their target, and there was something in the steadiness of his hand, the confidence in his stance, that made Miguel's instincts scream danger. "We can all walk away from this," Frank continued, his voice level. "You tell your boss the witness is under martial protection now, or we can do this the hard way, which, I promise you, ends badly for everyone involved." The standoff stretched for 5 more heartbeats before Miguel made his decision. With a subtle nod to his companions, he lowered his weapon slightly. "Smart choice," Frank said, though his gun never wavered. "Now back out the way you came in." As the 3 men began slowly retreating toward the kitchen, Miguel locked eyes with the old Marshal one last time. "This isn't over," he promised. Frank, Castillo's expression remained impassive as stone. "Son, for your sake, I hope it is, because if you come back, I'll be waiting. And retired doesn't mean forgotten. There are still plenty of badgers in this town who owe me favors." When the intruders had finally backed out through the door, Frank Castillo moved to the window, watching as the black SUV pulled away from the curb. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number from memory. "Tom, it's Frank." "Yeah, I know what time it is. Listen, we've got a situation. El Serpiente just made a move on my neighbor, Elena Morales. 3 professionals. Yeah, that's right, the witness from the Ortiz case. They've found her. No, I handled it, but they'll be back with more men next time. We need to move her tonight." Frank hung up and stared out into the darkness, his jaw set in grim determination. Retirement would have to wait a little longer. The hunt was on again, but this time, the predators had brought the fight to his doorstep, and Frank Castillo had never been one to back down from a fight. Frank Castillo sat on his front porch, nursing a cup of black coffee as the first rays of sunrise painted the San Antonio sky in shades of amber and gold. 3 days before the events that would shatter the quiet of Sycamore Lane, the retired U.S. Marshal had been following the same routine he'd maintained for the past 18 months of his retirement. The morning air carried a hint of autumn, a welcome relief from the punishing Texas summer. Frank's weathered fingers traced the rim of his coffee mug, a souvenir from his final fugitive apprehension in Ciudad Juarez. The ceramic was chipped at the edge, battle damage from the day he'd packed up his desk at the Marshal's office after 32 years of service. "Another beautiful morning, Mr. Castillo," called Mrs. Hernandez from next door as she collected her newspaper. The 70-year-old widow had been bringing him homemade tamales every Sunday since he'd moved in, convinced that a man living alone would starve without intervention. Frank raised his mug in greeting. "Sure is, Gloria. How's that grandson of yours doing at college?" "Oh, Miguel is studying all the time. He says the engineering program is very difficult, but he's managing." Pride radiated from her face. "Will you be at the neighborhood watch meeting tonight?" "Wouldn't miss it," Frank replied, though the thought of sitting through another 2-hour session discussing stolen garden gnomes and suspicious door-to-door salesmen made him yearn for the days when threat assessment meant something entirely different. As Mrs. Hernandez continued her morning ritual, Frank's gaze drifted to house number 1742 across the street, the home of Elena Morales. She'd moved in just 3 months ago, quiet and skittish as a desert hare. Frank had noticed immediately how she always checked her surroundings before entering or leaving her house, how she kept her curtains drawn, how her eyes darted nervously whenever a car slowed down on their street. Old habits die hard in Frank's profession. He'd run a discreet background check through his former colleague Tom Reyes, who still worked at the San Antonio field office. The results had been illuminating. Elena Morales was actually Elena Vasquez, a cleaning woman who had unwittingly walked in on Domingo Ortiz, El Serpiente's second-in-command, discussing shipment details with the cartel's distributors. Instead of fleeing, she'd gone straight to the DEA, agreeing to testify in exchange for protection until the trial. The witness protection program had placed her in this quiet neighborhood under a new identity, believing the middle-class suburb would be the last place the cartel would look. Frank had kept this knowledge to himself, maintaining a neighborly but respectful distance. Still, he made sure to be outside when she left for work each morning at the local hospital. where she'd been placed as an administrative assistant, and he often found reasons to be in his front yard when she returned in the evenings. The front door of 1742 opened, and Elena emerged, dressed in scrubs and carrying her lunch bag. Frank raised his coffee mug as she locked her door. "Morning, Elena. Looks like another scorcher today." She gave him a guarded smile. "Good morning, Mr. Castillo. Yes, I think summer isn't quite finished with us yet. Please, I've told you, call me Frank. Mr. Castillo makes me feel like I should be checking my mailbox for social security checks." He chuckled, though he'd been collecting those checks for 18 months now. Elena's smile grew a fraction warmer. "Frank, then. Have a good day." As she walked to her car, Frank noted how she scanned the street before getting in, a habit born of well-founded fear. He waited until her sedan had disappeared around the corner before going back inside to get dressed for the day. Frank's house was modestly furnished but meticulously organized. Decades in law enforcement had instilled in him a preference for minimalism and order. The living room held a comfortable recliner positioned for optimal views of both the television and the front window. A bookshelf housed his collection of history books and true crime narratives, many written by former colleagues. Unlike many retirees who displayed their career memorabilia prominently, Frank kept most of his inboxes in the spare bedroom. The walls were mostly bare except for a few family photos, his late wife Maria, their daughter Sophia with her husband and 2 children in Seattle, and one picture from his Marshal days. Frank standing with his former partner Dave Lowry outside the courthouse in El Paso after the successful prosecution of a notorious gang leader. The one piece of his former life that remained accessible was locked in the drawer of his bedside table. His service weapon, a Sig Sauer P226, maintained in perfect condition alongside his retired marshal's badge. Some habits couldn't be broken, or perhaps deep down, Frank had never fully believed his hunting days were over. Frank dressed in jeans and a faded blue button-down, slipped on comfortable walking shoes and grabbed his wallet and keys. Tuesday meant grocery shopping and his weekly lunch with Dave Lowry, who had retired 2 years before him. The Oakwood Shopping Center was only a 10-minute drive from Frank's house. He pushed a cart through the aisles of Johnson's Grocery, methodically, checking items off his modest list. As he reached for a carton of eggs, he noticed a young mother struggling to keep her toddler seated in the shopping cart, while trying to compare prices on cereal boxes. "Here, let me help you with that," Frank offered, steadying the cart as the child attempted another escape. "Thank you," the woman sighed gratefully. "He's been in perpetual motion since he learned to walk." Frank smiled. "My daughter was the same way. Used to joke that she was training to be a fugitive the way she could disappear in department stores." He made a silly face at the boy, who giggled and momentarily forgot his escape plans. "You have children?" the woman asked, successfully retrieving her cereal. "One daughter. She's out in Seattle now with my grandkids." A familiar pang of longing surfaced as he thought of Sophia and the grandchildren he saw only twice a year. "Those little ones will keep you on your toes, but you'll miss it when they're grown." After finishing his shopping, Frank loaded the groceries into his trunk and drove to Rosie's Diner, a local institution that had been serving comfort food since the 1970s. Dave was already there, occupying their usual booth by the window. "You're late," Dave announced as Frank slid into the seat across from him. At 67, Dave Lowry, Wester years older than Frank, with a full head of white hair and the perpetually sunburned complexion of a man who spent most of his retirement on fishing boats. "By 3 minutes, Frank countered, checking his watch, "and only because I was being a good Samaritan in the grocery store. Saving the world one shopping cart at a time now." Dave's eyes crinkled with amusement. Quite the step down from chasing cartel enforcers across the border. Rosie herself approached their table, a tradition for her longtime customers. "The usual for you boys, bacon cheeseburger with extra onions for Dave, club sandwich and coleslaw for Frank." "You know us too well, Rosie," Frank confirmed. As she walked away, Dave leaned forward. "So, how's retirement treating you? Still climbing the walls?" Frank shrugged. "It's fine. Quiet." "Which you hate," Dave stated matter-of-factly. "You forget, I've known you for 25 years, Castillo. You were never built for quiet." "I'm adjusting," Frank replied, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. The first year after retirement, he'd taken on private security consulting just to keep his mind occupied. When those jobs dried up, he'd reluctantly settled into the rhythm of civilian life. Neighborhood watch meetings, weekly lunches with former colleagues, volunteer work at the Veterans Center, and long-distance calls with Sophia and the grandkids. Heard anything from the old office? Frank asked, trying to sound casual. Dave snorted. You mean, have I heard anything about cases you might find interesting? Man, you are worse than those junkies we used to arrest. At least they admitted they had a problem. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their food. For a few minutes, they ate in companionable silence. Two men who had seen the worst humanity had to offer, and somehow managed to retain their sanity and their capacity for enjoying simple pleasures like a good diner meal. Actually, Dave said between bites, I did hear something interesting. The Ortiz trial is heating up. Word is El Serpiente is getting nervous about the witness testimonies lining up. Frank's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Domingo Ortiz. Thought that trial was still months away. Preliminary hearings start next week. They've got this cleaning. Lady who walked in on a major meeting. Apparently she can place Ortiz, 2 distributors, and a dirty cop all in the same room with product and ledgers. Frank's mind immediately went to Elena, her nervous glances, her careful surveillance of her surroundings. Witness protection handling her security. Dave nodded. Supposedly. Though between budget cuts and the fact that half the newer marshals couldn't track a bleeding elephant through snow, I wouldn't bet my pension on it. He studied Frank's face. Why? You know something? Just professional curiosity, Frank replied, deliberately casual as he returned to his sandwich. Dave's eyes narrowed, skeptically. Frank Castillo doesn't do just curious. What's going on? Before Frank could respond, the diner's door opened and a group of men in business suits entered. Nothing unusual about that, except Frank immediately recognized one of them as Manuel Diaz, a defense attorney known for representing high-profile cartel members. Beside him walked a well-dressed man with cold eyes and a thin scar running from his left eyebrow to his cheekbone. Frank turned away slightly, angling himself to be less noticeable while maintaining a view of the men in their flexion of the window. Dave, sensing the shift in his friend's demeanor, didn't turn around but lowered his voice. What is it? 3 o'clock, Manuel Diaz and friends. Dave took a casual sip of his water. The guy with the scar, that's Victor Salazar, Ortiz's right-hand man. Rumor has it he's taking over more responsibilities while Ortiz awaits trial. Frank watched as the group settled into a corner booth, well out of earshot. Interesting place for a meeting. Bit public for cartel business. Maybe they're just fans of Rosie's pie, Dave joked, though his expression remained serious. Though I'll bet me fishing boat, they're not here to discuss legal strategy over meatloaf. The remainder of their lunch was spent in more careful conversation, both men aware of the cartel presence across the restaurant. When they finished eating, Frank paid the bill. It was his turn, and they walked out together, deliberately not looking in the direction of Diaz's table. In the parking lot, Dave gripped Frank's shoulder. Whatever you're mixed up in, be careful. These guys don't play by any rules we understand. Who says I'm mixed up in anything? Frank countered. Dave just shook his head. Like I said, 25 years, partner. I can read you like yesterday's newspaper. Just watch your back. As Frank drove home, his mind kept returning to Elena Morales and the cartel men at the diner. If Ortiz's people were growing nervous about the upcoming trial, Elena's borrowed time might be running out faster than anyone realized. Back at home, Frank unloaded his groceries and then performed a ritual he'd maintained since retirement. He checked his security system, examining the discrete cameras he'd installed to monitor the perimeter of his property. Some might call it paranoia. Frank called it prudence. Men in his position made enemies. A memory in the cartel world was long. The afternoon passed quietly. Frank spent an hour on the phone with Sophia, listening to stories about his grandchildren and promising for the dozenth time that he'd fly out for Thanksgiving. After hanging up, he did his daily workout, a modified version of the regimen he'd maintained during his service years. At 65, he was still remarkably fit, though his joints protested more than they used to. As evening approached, Frank sat on his back porch, watching the sunset with a glass of bourbon. Their neighborhood settled into its twilight rhythm, sprinklers turning on, children being called inside for dinner, the distant sound of a basketball game on someone's television. From this vantage point, he could see into Elena's backyard. She was watering a small garden of herbs and tomato plants, her movements efficient, but somehow still betraying the underlying tension she carried everywhere. Frank wondered what it must be like for her, torn from her previous life, living under an assumed identity, knowing that powerful men wanted her silenced permanently. As darkness fell, Frank checked his watch. The neighborhood watch meeting would start in 30 minutes. He rose to go inside when he noticed a car driving slowly down the street, an expensive black Cadillac with tinted windows, definitely not from the neighborhood. The vehicle passed Elena's house, then Frank's, before, continuing around the corner. Could be nothing, Frank told himself. Could be someone's relative visiting. Could be someone lost. But the familiar sensation in his gut, the one that had kept him alive through decades of dangerous work, told him otherwise. Something was coming. He could feel it in the air, like the electric tension before a Texas thunderstorm. Frank went inside and opened the drawer of his bedside table. His fingers closed around the familiar grip of his service weapon, checking it automatically before securing it in his holster. He slipped on a light jacket despite the warmth of the evening, concealing the weapon from casual observation. As he headed out for the neighborhood watch meeting, Frank paused at his front door, looking across at Elena's house. Her lights were on, curtains drawn as always. For now, she was safe. But for how long? The retired marshal locked his door and stepped into the gathering darkness, carrying the weight of 32 years of hunting men for whom human life meant nothing. He had chosen this quiet street for his retirement, hoping to leave violence and danger behind. But as the saying went among the marshals, you can retire from the badge, but the badge never retires from you. The neighborhood watch meeting ran longer than usual, dominated by Mrs. Keller's impassioned 40-minute presentation on the increasing boldness of local raccoons. Frank sat through it with the patience of a man who'd once spent 72 hours in a freezing surveillance van tracking a fugitive, though his mind repeatedly drifted to the black Cadillac he'd seen cruising the neighborhood. When the meeting finally ended at 9:45 p.m., Frank declined offers of leftover cookies and coffee, making his excuses to head home. Outside, the October night had turned cooler, a crisp breeze rustling through the oak trees that lined the community center's walkway. Frank zipped up his jacket, his hand brushing against the concealed Sig Sauer, a reassuring presence. His phone vibrated as he reached his truck. Tom Reyes, his former colleague still active with the Marshals. Castillo, Frank answered, his voice automatically shifting to the clipped professional tone of his service years. Frank, it's Tom. We might have a situation with your neighbor. Frank's body tensed, instantly alert. Elena Morales, what happened? Nothing yet, Tom replied, the background noise suggesting he was in a moving vehicle. But we got intel from a confidential informant that Ortiz put out the order. They know where she is, Frank. A team's been dispatched for emergency relocation. But I'm still 20 minutes out. Who else knows? Frank asked, already sliding into his truck and starting the engine. Just the immediate team. Protocol is tight on this one. Frank's mind raced through the implications. The black Cadillac. I saw. That was reconnaissance. Probably. Listen, Frank, I know what you're thinking, but this is an active witness security operation. You're retired. Just sit tight. Call for local PD backup, Frank interrupted, pulling out of the parking lot. I'm 5 minutes from her house. Frank. 20 minutes might be too long, Tom. You know how these people operate. Frank's voice was calm but brooking no argument. I'm just going to check on her until you get there. He hung up before Tom could protest further, his truck accelerating down the quiet suburban streets. The digital clock on his dashboard read 9:52 p.m. Streetlights cast pools of yellow illumination at regular intervals, the houses between them dark except for the occasional blue flicker of television screens. As Frank turned onto Sycamore Lane, his trained eye immediately registered something wrong. Two unfamiliar vehicles were parked halfway down the block, a dark sedan and a white panel van without company markings, both positioned for quick exit routes. He cut his headlights and pulled over 3 houses away from Elena's, his heartbeat steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through his system. Drawing his weapon, he checked the magazine and chambered, a round with practiced efficiency. Frank exited his truck silently, keeping to the shadows between houses as he approached. The neighborhood was quiet, too quiet. No dogs barking, no distant conversations or music. It was as if the entire street was holding its breath. At the edge of Mrs. Hernandez's property, Frank paused, surveying Elena's house. The lights were on, curtains drawn as usual, but something about the stillness felt wrong. No movement visible. Through the slight gaps in the curtains, no shadows passing back and forth. A muffled noise from the back of the house made his decision for him. Frank moved across the lawn in a crouch, years of training overriding the protests of his aging knees. As he rounded the corner of Elena's house, the back door came into view, slightly ajar, the security light above it disabled. They were already inside. Frank pressed himself against the exterior wall, listening intently. Male voices, speaking low and urgent in Spanish, at least two distinct speakers. Elena's voice nowhere to be heard. ¿Dónde está ella? No está aquí. Where is she? She's not here. Revisa el sótano. Check the basement. Ya lo hice. Nada. Already did. Nothing. Frank's mind processed this information rapidly. Eleanor wasn't in the house. Either she'd managed to run before they arrived, or, more likely given Tom's call, she'd been warned and was hiding somewhere. The sound of breaking, glass echoed from inside, frustration manifesting as destruction. Frank knew he needed to act before the intruders expanded their search to neighboring houses. He had two choices: retreat and wait for backup, or engage and hope to defuse the situation. But waiting meant giving the cartel men time to find Elena, wherever she was hiding. Years of experience had taught Frank that hesitation usually ended with body bags. Decision made, he moved to the back door, weapon raised. Using the reflection in a small decorative mirror hanging on the porch, he counted 3 men inside, all armed, all with the hardened look of cartel enforcers. Frank took a deep breath, centering himself. Then, in one fluid motion, he pushed the door open and stepped inside, sweeping his weapon in an arc that covered all 3 intruders. "Federal Marshal, drop your weapons." His voice carried the absolute authority that had made countless fugitives comply over the decades. The 3 men froze momentarily, genuine surprise registering on their faces. They'd clearly not expected armed resistance, especially not from a federal officer. That moment of shock gave Frank his advantage. Las armas. Ahora. The weapons. Now. Frank's Spanish was fluent, honed by years of cross-border operations. The standoff lasted exactly 2 seconds before the nearest man, young, with a neck tattoo partially visible above his collar, made his fatal mistake. His hand twitched toward the pistol tucked in his waistband. Frank's first shot caught him center mass, dropping him instantly. The other 2 reacted immediately, diving for cover behind the kitchen island as they drew their weapons. Gunfire erupted, bullets splintering the doorframe where Frank had been standing a heartbeat earlier. But Frank had already moved, sliding to a position behind a heavy oak cabinet. Glass shattered and wood splintered as the cartel men fired wildly in his direction. "You're outgunned and surrounded," Frank called out, keeping his voice steady. "Police are already on their way." A barked laugh answered him. "Mentiroso." "Liar. You're alone, viejo, and we only need a few more minutes to find the bitch." Confirmation that they hadn't located Elena yet. Good. Frank needed to keep it that way. He caught movement reflected in the shattered glass of a picture frame, one of the men trying to circle around through the dining room. Frank waited until the shadow grew closer, then fired twice through the wall. A grunt of pain and the thud of a body hitting the floor told him at least one shot had connected. "That's 2 down," Frank called out. "Last chance to walk away." The answer came in the form of another volley of bullets, this time more focused on his position. The oak cabinet wouldn't withstand sustained fire. Frank needed to move. As the gunfire paused, the shooter likely reloading, Frank rolled from behind the cabinet and fired 3 rapid shots toward the kitchen island. He didn't expect to hit anything, but the suppressing fire gave him the seconds he needed to dash into the hallway. The remaining cartel enforcer shouted into a radio, calling for backup. Frank's window of opportunity was closing fast. Moving down the darkened hallway, Frank positioned himself at the corner where it opened into the living room, giving him a partial view of the kitchen. The shooter was still behind the island, but now Frank could see his leg exposed at the bottom. One careful shot to the knee, and the man's scream echoed through the house as he collapsed. His weapon skittered across the tile floor, well out of reach. Frank moved forward cautiously, keeping his weapon trained on the injured man writhing on the floor. The first shooter lay motionless by the back door, while the second was slumped against the dining room wall, blood seeping through his shirt from a wound in his shoulder. Still alive, but not a threat. "Where's your backup?" Frank demanded, kicking the fallen pistol further away. The man glared up at him, teeth gritted against the pain. "Coming, pendejo, and they'll kill you and the witness both." The wail of distant sirens filtered through the broken windows, San Antonio PD responding to the shots fired. Frank knew he had minutes at most. "Where's Elena?" he asked the wounded man, who responded with a pained laugh. "You're too late, Marshal. Our men will find her before your people do." A chill ran down Frank's spine. "What men? How many are in the area?" The man just smiled through his pain, blood staining his teeth red. Frank's instincts screamed that something was wrong. This attack felt rushed, uncoordinated, almost like a diversion. The realization hit him just as headlights swept across the front window. Not police lights, regular headlights. Frank moved to the window, staying to the side as he peered out. The black Cadillac from earlier had returned, stopping directly in front of his house across the street. Two men exited, moving with purpose, toward his front door. Frank's blood ran cold. If Elena wasn't here— "She's at my house," he whispered, the pieces clicking into place. Elena must have sensed danger and gone to the one person she thought could protect her. Or perhaps she'd been warned by Tom's team and told to go to Frank's until they arrived. Either way, she had inadvertently put herself directly in the path of a second cartel team. The sirens were getting closer, but they'd be too late. Frank had to make a choice: stay with the subdued attackers or go after Elena. No choice at all. He quickly zip-tied the wounded men using plastic ties from Elena's kitchen drawer, standard preparedness for a former marshal, and grabbed the radio from the floor. Cartel communications might prove valuable. "Tell your boss," Frank said to the knee-wounded man as he finished securing him, "that Elena Morales is under my protection now. He comes after her again, he'll need more than 3 men. The man spat blood onto the floor. "You're a dead man walking, viejo." Frank didn't bother responding. He moved to the back door, checking both ways before sprinting across the yards toward his house. The pain in his knees and back that normally accompanied any strenuous activity was nowhere to be felt. Adrenaline and training overriding the complaints of age. As he approached his property from the rear, Frank could see the 2 men from the Cadillac had already forced entry through his front door. The neighborhood remained eerily quiet, despite the gunfire from minutes earlier, residents likely huddling in interior rooms, calling 911. Frank's back door was locked, but he had a hidden key in a magnetized box under the deck. Retrieving it, hesitantly let himself in through the utility room. Voices filtered from the front of the house, harsh, demanding, "¿Dónde está ella?" A woman's frightened voice responded, "Elena. No sé de quién hablas. Soy solo la vecina." "I don't know who you're talking about. I'm just the neighbor." A sharp sound, a slap, followed by a cry of pain. "Mentirosa. We know who you are, Elena Vasquez." Frank moved through the darkened hallway like a shadow, each step precise, controlled. He had the advantage of knowing every creaking floorboard, every piece of furniture that might betray his presence. When he reached the living room entrance, he paused, assessing the situation through the reflection in a decorative mirror on the wall. 2 men, one holding Elena by the hair, a gun pressed to her temple, the other ransacking the living room, presumably looking for a place she might have hidden. Elena's face was streaked with tears, a red mark blooming on her cheek where she'd been struck. But here ease. Her eyes were defiant, burning with a refusal to beg or break. Frank weighed his options. A direct confrontation risked Elena's life, but the longer he waited, the more time the men had to receive word from their companions across the street that something had gone wrong. The decision was made for him when the radio at his hip suddenly crackled to life. Equipo uno, responda. Tienen a la mujer. Team 1, respond. Do you have the woman? Both intruders whipped their heads toward the sound. Frank had no choice. He stepped into the doorway, weapon raised. Federal Marshal, drop your weapons now. The man holding Eleanor reacted instantly, using her as a shield while pressing the gun harder against her temple. Stay back or she dies. Frank kept his aim steady, his expression betraying nothing of the calculations running through his mind. You kill her, you don't leave this house alive. Simple math. The second man had drawn his weapon but looked uncertain, eyes darting between Frank and his companion. Your friends across the street are already in custody, Frank continued, his voice level. Police will be here any second. This ends one of 2 ways. You walk out in cuffs, or you leave in body bags. Your choice. The standoff stretched, tension thick enough to cut. Elena's eyes locked with Frank's, a silent communication passing between them. She gave an almost imperceptible nod. In the next instant, Elena suddenly went limp, dropping her weight downward. The momentary shift in balance was all Frank needed. His shot was precise, catching her captor in the shoulder of his gun arm. The man howled in pain, his weapon discharging harmlessly into the ceiling as he staggered backward. The second gunman fired wildly in Frank's direction, bullets splintering the doorframe. Frank rolled to the side, coming up on one knee and firing twice. The first shot missed, but the second caught the man in the chest. He collapsed against the wall, gun clattering to the floor. Elena scrambled away from her wounded captor, who was clutching his bleeding shoulder and cursing. Frank moved forward, kicking the fallen weapon away and training his gun on the injured man. "No te muevas!" "Don't move." Frank's command froze the man in place. Outside, the wail of sirens grew louder, flashing lights now visible through the windows. Backup had finally arrived. "You okay?" Frank asked Eleanor, not taking his eyes off the wounded intruder. She nodded, shakily, her hand touching the reddened mark on her cheek. I came here when I saw cars watching my house. I thought I would be safer with you." Her voice broke slightly. "I'm sorry I brought this to your door." "You did the right thing," Frank assured her. "Help is coming. We'll get you somewhere safe." The wounded man laughed bitterly despite his pain. "Nowhere is safe from El Serpiente. He has people everywhere. Police, government, courts. You think this is over? This is just beginning." Frank's expression hardened. "For you, it's over." He turned to Elena. "Get my handcuffs from the drawer in the kitchen, second drawer near the stove." As Elena moved to comply, the injured man's eyes narrowed. "You're not regular police, too old. Who are you?" "The wrong man to mess with," Frank replied simply. Red and blue lights flooded the room as police cars pulled up outside. Voices shouted commands, officers establishing a perimeter. Through the window, Frank could see Tom Reyes's unmarked SUV arriving as well. Elena returned with the handcuffs, keeping her distance from the wounded cartel enforcer. Frank secured him efficiently, checking that the second man was still breathing. He was, though unconscious and losing blood quickly. "Get a medical team in here," Frank called toward the front door as the first officers approached cautiously, weapons drawn. "Federal Marshal, retired," Frank identified himself. "2 suspects down, secured. Need immediate medical assistance and perimeter security." The next hour passed in organized chaos. Paramedics treating the wounded, police securing both crime scenes, statements being taken. Frank stayed by Elena's side throughout, refusing to let her out of his sight, even as Tom Reyes and his witness security team arrived to take charge of the situation. In the relative privacy of a police cruiser, Tom updated Frank on what had happened. "Our informant came through just in time. Ortiz put out a $50,000 bounty on her head this afternoon, dead or alive. We were mobilizing to move her when you called." Frank's jaw tightened. "Leak in your department." Tom's expression was grim. "Has to be. The safe house location was level 4 classified. Only 6 people had that information. And now? New location. New identity. Documentation is already being processed. We'll move her tonight, once the scene is secure." Frank looked across the street, where Eleanor sat in an ambulance. A blanket wrapped around her shoulders as a female officer took her statement. Despite everything, she sat straight-backed, answering questions with composure. "She's stronger than she looks," Frank observed. "She'll need to be." Tom followed his gaze. "This was just the first attempt. Ortiz won't stop until she's silenced or he's behind bars for good." A thought that had been forming in Frank's mind since the first shots were fired now crystallized into certainty. "Your department has a leak. You move her to another safe house. Same thing happens. Different faces, same result." Tom ran a hand through his graying hair in frustration. "What's the alternative? We can't just leave here unprotected." "You don't." Frank turned to face his former colleague. "I protect her." Tom stared at him. "Frank, you're retired. This isn't your fight. It became my fight when they kicked in my front door." Frank's voice was quiet but resolute. "Besides, I'm not in your chain of command. No one knows to look for her with me." "What are you suggesting? Some kind of off-the-books protection detail?" "The department would never—" "Not the department. Me." Frank's expression made it clear this wasn't a request. "Official record shows Elena Vasquez relocated to a safe house tonight. Meanwhile, she comes with me. I have a cabin in the hill country, remote, defensible, off any paper trail connected to the Marshal service." Tom shook his head. That's completely against protocol. If anything happened, then I take full responsibility. Frank's gaze was unwavering. You know as well as I do that protocol won't keep her alive if there's a leak. You need someone outside the system. For a long moment, Tom said nothing, the weight of 30 years of friendship and professional respect hanging between them. Finally, he sighed. I'll need to clear this with the higher-ups, unofficially. Do what you need to, but she leaves with me tonight. Frank's tone made it clear the decision was already made. Tom glanced over at Elena. What about her? Don't you think she should have a say in this? Of course, Frank nodded. But I think after tonight, she'll understand that traditional protection has its vulnerabilities. As if sensing their discussion, Eleanor looked up, her eyes meeting Frank's across the chaos of emergency vehicles and personnel. Something passed between them, an understanding born in the crucible of violence, a recognition that their lives had irrevocably intersected. In that moment, Frank Castillo knew with absolute certainty that he had left retirement behind. The quiet life on Sycamore Lane had ended in blood and gunfire, replaced by a familiar state of hypervigilance and purpose that, despite everything, felt like coming home. The hunt was on again, but this time, Frank wasn't tracking a fugitive. He was the one being hunted. The radio from the cartel enforcer crackled once more on the seat beside him, a voice speaking rapid Spanish, demanding updates, issuing threats. Frank picked it up, considering his next move. His finger pressed the transmit button. This is U.S. Marshal Frank Castillo, he said in clear, deliberate Spanish. Your men failed. Elena Vasquez is under my protection now. Tell Domingo Ortiz that if he wants her, he'll have to come through me. He released the button, silence falling as he waited for a response. When it came, the voice was different, colder, more controlled. You've made a mistake, Marshal Castillo. A fatal one. We will find you. Both of you. Frank's expression remained impassive. Many have tried. He set the radio down, turning to find Tom staring at him in disbelief. Tell me you didn't just deliberately antagonize the Serpiente cartel. Frank shrugged. Better they focus on me than scramble to find her new location. Besides, a grim smile touched his lips. I've always worked better when the target knows I'm coming. Tom shook his head, resignation and grudging respect mingling in his expression. God help us all. Frank Castillo is back in the game. Across the street, Elena watched the exchange, unaware that her fate had just been decided. But something in the set of Frank's shoulders, the purposeful way he moved as he crossed toward her, told her that everything had changed. The night air carried the scent of cordite and blood. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the police lights, watchers would be reporting back to their masters. The first battle had been fought, but the war was just beginning. Frank approached Elena, his expression softening slightly. We need to talk about what happens next. She straightened, meeting his gaze directly. They'll keep coming, won't they? Yes. Eleanor nodded, a decision visibly forming behind her eyes. Then I'll keep fighting. For justice. For my future. She glanced at the ambulance where one of the cartel men was being loaded, still handcuffed to the gurney. What do we do now? Frank Castillo looked out into the night, toward the invisible, enemies gathering beyond the light. Now, he said quietly, we disappear. Pack light. Essentials only. We leave in 15 minutes. Frank's instructions were crisp as he led Eleanor through the back door of the police station. The official debriefing had taken 2 hours, statements given, forms signed, the bureaucratic machinery grinding on despite the urgency of their situation. Now, at 2:47 a.m., they were finally moving. Tom Reyes had arranged their exit, creating a paper trail that showed Elena being transported to a safe house in Austin. Meanwhile, Frank's truck waited in the station's employee lot, fueled and ready. What about my things? My clothes? My documents? Eleanor's voice betrayed her exhaustion, though her eyes remained alert. Basic necessities are already in the truck, Frank replied, scanning the parking lot for any sign of surveillance. Anything else? We'll get on the road. Your old life? It's gone now. The sooner you accept that, the better your chances. Harsh words, perhaps, but Frank had seen too many witnesses falter because they couldn't let go of who they used to be. In his experience, nostalgia was a luxury that got people killed. Elena fell silent, absorbing the brutal reality of her situation. When she spoke again, her voice was steadier. I understand. They reached Frank's truck without incident. As Elena climbed into the passenger seat, she noticed the vehicle wasn't Frank's usual pickup, but an older model Jeep Cherokee with tinted windows. Borrowed from a friend, Frank explained, answering her unspoken question as he started the engine. My truck's too recognizable. The night air was thick with humidity as they pulled out of the lot, the city streets nearly empty at this hour. Frank drove methodically, taking a circuitous route that included multiple turns, occasional backtracking, and several long straightaways where any tail would be exposed. Elena watched him work, noting the practiced precision of his movements, the way his eyes constantly swept between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. You've done this before, she observed. Frank nodded without taking his eyes from the road. Hundreds of times. Usually from the other side, though. The hunter instead of the hunted. Something like that. For 20 minutes, they drove in silence, leaving the city behind as they headed northwest into the hill country. The highway stretched before them, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the darkness. Occasionally, headlights would appear in the distance, each one causing Frank to tense slightly until they passed. Tell me about the cabin, Elena said finally, perhaps seeking distraction from the tension that hung between them. It belonged to my wife's family, Frank replied. Maria and I used it for weekend getaways, fishing trips. After she passed, I kept it maintained but don't visit often. It's remote, 5 acres, well off the main roads. Nearest neighbor is 3 miles away. Sounds lonely, Frank's expression softened momentarily. Maria used to call it our piece of nowhere, said it was the only place I truly relaxed. A faint smile touched his lips. She was right. Eleanor studied him in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. I'm sorry about your wife. Cancer, 8 years ago. Frank's grip tightened almost imperceptibly on the steering wheel. She fought hard. Like you. His eyes met hers briefly. She was the strong one. The conversation lapsed again, the hum of tires on asphalt filling the space between them. After nearly an hour of driving, Frank turned off the highway onto progressively smaller roads, eventually transitioning to a gravel path that wound through dense oak and cedar trees. Almost there, he said, slowing the Jeep as they approached. A metal gate. Frank retrieved a key from the sun visor and handed it to Eleanor. Mind getting that? Lock it behind us. Eleanor did as instructed, the gate's hinges protesting with a rusty groan. As she secured the padlock after they'd passed through, she looked back at the dark road behind them. Their connection to civilization now literally closed off. The cabin materialized from the darkness as they rounded a final bend. A modest structure of stone and timber, nestled against a hillside overlooking a small natural pond. Nothing fancy, but solid and secure. Home sweet home, Frank announced without irony as he killed the engine. At least for now, he retrieved a flashlight from the glove compartment, leading the way to the front door. The cabin's interior was cool and smelled of cedar and the faintest hint of wood smoke. Frank moved through the space with practiced familiarity, flipping switches to activate a generator somewhere outside. Moments later, soft light filled the main room. Solar with generator backup, he explained. Off-grid, but reasonably comfortable. Water comes from a well, propane for cooking and hot water. Elena took in her surroundings. A central living area, with a stone fireplace, small kitchen to one side, 2 doors presumably leading to bedrooms. Simple furnishings, functional rather than decorative. A row of windows faced the pond, with heavy shutters currently secured over them. Bathrooms through there, Frank pointed. You take the bedroom on the right. I've had some clothes delivered. Nothing fancy, but they should fit. Get some rest if you can. Tomorrow will be a long day. Elena nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by the events of the past 12 hours. The adrenaline that had sustained her was ebbing, leaving bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. What about you? She asked, noticing Frank checking the locks rather than heading to his own room. I'll sleep later, he replied, not meeting her eyes. Need to secure the perimeter first. Elena wanted to argue, to insist he rest too, but the determined set of his jaw told her it would be futile. Instead, she moved toward the indicated bedroom, pausing at the doorway. Thank you, she said softly. For saving my life. For all of this. Frank looked up. something unreadable flashing across his weathered features. "Get some sleep, Elena. The fight's just starting." As the door closed behind her, Frank methodically checked every entry point of the cabin, placing small, nearly invisible alarms on each window and door, simple devices that would alert him to any attempt at intrusion. He then retrieved a duffel bag from the jeep, unpacking a small arsenal, his service weapon, a shotgun, a hunting rifle with scope, and several boxes of ammunition. Finally, he placed a satellite phone on the kitchen counter and programmed a single number into it, Tom Reyes. Their only connection to the outside world now. Outside, the first hints of dawn were lightening the eastern sky. Frank stepped onto the porch, scanning the tree line, with the eyes of a man who had spent decades reading landscapes for signs of human presence. Nothing but the stirring of wildlife as the forest awakened. For now, they were safe. But Frank harbored no illusions about how long that might last. The sun was rising on their first day as fugitives. Victor Salazar's face betrayed no emotion as he listened to the report, though the muscle ticking in his jaw suggested the calm was merely surface deep. The messenger, a young lieutenant named Javier, stood rigidly before the ornate desk, sweat beading on his forehead despite the officer's aggressive air conditioning. "So," Victor said finally, his voice soft in a way that made Javier's skin crawl. "6 men, all either dead or in custody, the witness still alive, and now protected by some retired marshal." "We've gathered intel on him, sir," Javier offered quickly, sliding a folder across the desk. "Frank Castillo, 32 years with the U.S. Marshals, specialized in high-risk apprehensions and witness protection. Retired 18 months ago. Decorated multiple times. Known for being—" He hesitated. "For being what?" Victor prompted. "Relentless, sir. They called him El Fantasma in Juarez, the ghost. Because once he started hunting they disappeared." Victor finished, opening the folder to study the photograph within. A silver-haired man with hard eyes and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades making difficult decisions and living with the consequences. Victor tapped the photo thoughtfully. "Where is he now?" "We don't know, sir. After the incident, both Castillo and the witness vanished. Official channels say she's been relocated to a safe house in Austin, but our sources indicate that's false information. So a veteran marshal has gone off-grid with our primary concern." Victor leaned back in his leather chair, fingers steepled. "And Mr. Ortiz expects results." The unspoken threat hung in the air. Domingo Ortiz might be awaiting trial, but his reach remained long, his patience notoriously short. Failure would have consequences far beyond mere professional disappointment. "We have assets searching," Javier hurried to assure him. "Traffic cameras, credit card activity, property records." "This man hunted cartel members for 3 decades, Victor interrupted. "Do you think he doesn't know exactly how to disappear?" He rose from his desk, moving to the window that overlooked downtown San Antonio. "No, traditional methods won't work. We need to think like him." He turned back to Javier. "Contact our people, in law enforcement. Focus on retired marshals, anyone who worked with Castillo. Find his friends, his family." A cold smile. "Everyone has connections they can't bear to sever completely." "Yes, sir." "And Javier?" Victor's voice dropped lower. "Put out a bounty. 100,000 for information leading to the witness. 200,000 for Castillo." Javier's eyes widened slightly at the amount. "Dead or alive?" "Dead is simpler," Victor replied. "But Mr. Ortiz would prefer the witness alive long enough to understand the cost of betrayal." As Javier left to carry out his orders, Victor returned to the photograph, studying the face of the man who had unwittingly placed himself between El Serpiente and its prey. "Welcome back to the game, Marshal," he murmured. "Let's see how well you play from the other side." At the cabin, morning brought a tentative routine. Frank had slept briefly on the couch, waking at the first bird song to make a perimeter check. When Eleanor emerged from her room around 7, she found him at the kitchen table, cleaning his service weapon with methodical precision. "Coffee's fresh," he said without looking up. "Eggs and bread in the fridge if you're hungry." Eleanor helped herself to coffee, noting with mild surprise how well stocked the kitchen was. "You were prepared for this?" "Not specifically," Frank admitted, reassembling the pistol with practiced movements. "But in my line of work, having a bolt hole is just good sense." She sat across from him, cradling the mug between her hands. In the morning light, The events of the previous night seemed almost dreamlike, though the bruise on her cheek provided tangible evidence of the reality. "What happens now?" she asked. Frank set the cleaned weapon aside. "Now we establish patterns, security protocols, communication channels with Tom." He met her eyes. "And we prepare you for testimony." "I've already given my statement multiple times." "To agents who haven't been shot at," Frank interjected. "Trust me, there's a difference between preparing a witness in a secure conference room and preparing one who's survived an attempt on their life." Elena nodded slowly. "So we just wait here until the trial?" "The preliminary hearing is in 3 weeks. The full trial could be months away." Frank's expression was grim. "But no, we won't stay here that long. 2 weeks maximum before we need to move. First rule of survival: never get comfortable." The day passed in a blur of practical education. Frank walked Eleanor through the cabin's security measures, escape routes, and emergency protocols. He taught her how to use the satellite phone, emphasizing that it was for absolute emergencies only. Every call, no matter how brief, created a digital footprint that could potentially be traced. In the afternoon, they ventured outside, Frank leading her on a tour of the property's perimeter. The October sun filtered through the trees, dappling the ground with shifting patterns of light. Under different circumstances, it might have been peaceful. "Listen," Frank said suddenly, stopping on a ridge overlooking the pond. Elena froze, straining her ears. "I don't hear anything." "Exactly," Frank gestured to the surrounding forest. Birds stopped singing. Something, or someone, disturbed them. Elena's heartbeat quickened. "Cartel? Could be, or could be a deer." Frank drew his weapon regardless, motioning for Eleanor to stay behind him as they moved cautiously back toward the cabin. "This is lesson 1. Pay attention to the environment. Nature's the best alarm system there is." They reached the cabin without incident, the forest gradually coming alive again with birdsong. False alarm, but Frank used it as a teaching moment, emphasizing the importance of constant vigilance. As evening approached, Frank prepared a simple meal while Elena reviewed the case files Tom had provided. Photographs, statements, evidence logs, all relating to what she had witnessed at the money-counting house. Frank observed her concentration, the methodical way she processed information. "You're not what I expected," he admitted as they ate. Elena looked up. "What did you expect?" "Someone more—" He hesitated, searching for the right word. "Fragile." A smile touched her lips, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Appearances can be deceiving, Marshal Castillo. I grew up in Ciudad Juarez. My father was killed by cartel violence when I was 9. My mother brought me to the US for a chance at something better." Her chin lifted slightly. "I'm not fragile. I'm furious." Frank nodded, reassessing the woman before him. "Fury's good fuel, as long as you don't let it cloud your judgment." The conversation shifted to practical matters: how long they could safely stay, what supplies they would need, contingency plans if they were discovered. Through it all, Frank noted Elena's clear thinking and pragmatic questions. She was adapting quickly to their situation, compartmentalizing fear in favor of preparation. As darkness fell, Frank activated the perimeter alarms and closed the shutters, transforming the cabin into a secure bunker. The satellite phone chirped at precisely 9 o'clock, Tom Reyes calling with the day's update. "All quiet on the official front," Tom reported. "Your disappearance has been successfully buried under paperwork. Officially, Elena is in a safe house in Austin, and you're on administrative leave following the incident." "And unofficially," Frank prompted. "Unofficially, all hell's breaking loose. Ortiz is furious. There's chatter about a major bounty on both your heads. They're pulling out all the stops, Frank. This isn't just about silencing a witness anymore. It's about saving face." Frank absorbed this information without visible reaction. "Any leads on the leak in your department?" "Nothing concrete. We've restricted information to absolute need to know, but—" Tom paused. "These people have resources. Money talks. Keep me posted. Next check-in tomorrow, same time." After ending the call, Frank found Eleanor watching him from the doorway, arms crossed protectively over her chest. "They won't stop coming, will they?" she asked quietly. "No," Frank answered honestly, "but neither will we." Later, as Elena retreated to her room, Frank sat at the kitchen table with a topographical map of the surrounding area, marking potential approach routes, defensive positions, escape paths. The familiar routine of tactical planning centered him, pushing back the nagging concerns about what they faced. He was older now, his reflexes a step slower than in his prime. The responsibility of keeping Elena alive weighed heavily, not just because it was his duty, but because something about her quiet determination resonated with him. She deserved justice, deserved a future beyond the shadow of El Serpiente. A sound from Elena's room drew his attention. Not a cry or call for help, but the muffled, private sound of someone weeping, but trying not to be heard. Frank remained at the table, granting her the dignity of facing her fear in private. He understood all too well the need to maintain composure during the day, only to have emotion demand its due when darkness fell. Outside, an owl called into the night. A reminder that life continued, oblivious to human drama. Frank checked his weapon one last time before stretching out on the couch, prepared for another night of light sleep, punctuated by security checks. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. For tonight at least, they were safe. But safety, as Frank knew all too well, was always temporary. 3 days passed in relative calm. Eleanor's bruises faded, and a tentative routine emerged. Mornings were devoted to physical preparation. Frank teaching Elena basic self-defense, how to handle a firearm, how to move through woods without leaving obvious signs. Afternoons focused on mental preparation, reviewing her testimony, anticipating, cross-examination tactics, strengthening her resolve to face or tease in court despite the threats. Frank found himself impressed by her resilience. Each morning she rose before dawn, ready to absorb whatever lessons he could provide. There was a quiet determination about her that reminded him of other witnesses he'd protected over the years. Ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances, finding strength they never knew they possessed. On the 4th morning, Frank decided it was time to test Elena's progress. After breakfast, he handed her Asmal backpack. "Today we're doing something different," he announced. "An exercise in evasion and survival. I want you to take this pack and head northwest from the cabin. There's a small clearing about 2 miles out, marked on this map." He indicated the location. "Your job is to reach it without being caught." Elena studied the map. "And you'll be hunting you," Frank replied simply. "Giving you a 30-minute head start, then coming after you. If I catch you before you reach the clearing, you fail." A hint of competitive fire sparked in Elena's eyes. "And if I make it? Then you get to choose dinner tonight instead of eating." "Whatever I decide to cook." A small smile cracked his usually stern expression, which, given my limited culinary skills, should be motivation enough. The exercise began at exactly 9 o'clock. Eleanor set off into the woods, compass in hand, moving with the careful attention Frank had drilled into her over the past days. The backpack contained basic survival supplies: water, energy bars, a first aid kit, a whistle for emergencies. Frank busied himself with cabin maintenance for the promised 30 minutes, checking his watch periodically. At precisely 9:30, he shouldered his own pack and followed Elena's trail. To her credit, she'd done well at concealing her path. Where the ground was soft enough to leave footprints, she'd used fallen branches to brush away her tracks. At one point, she'd doubled, back on her route, creating a false trail before veering in another direction, a technique he'd taught her just yesterday. Frank felt an unexpected surge of pride. She was learning quickly, adapting to her new reality with remarkable efficiency. Still, he could read the subtle signs she didn't yet know how to conceal. A broken twig here, disturbed moss there, the nearly imperceptible compression of pine needles. He followed her true path, moving quietly through the underbrush. About a mile from the cabin, Frank froze. Something wasn't right. The forest had gone quiet again, but in a different way than during a natural disturbance. This was the concentrated silence of human presence, someone trying very hard not to be heard. Frank dropped to a crouch, scanning his surroundings. Nothing moved, yet the sensation of being watched intensified. Drawing his sidearm, he remained perfectly still, controlling his breathing as he had been trained to do decades ago. There, a flash of movement about 70 yards to his left. Not Elena. The shape was wrong, larger, male, and moving with the deliberate stealth of a hunter. Frank's mind calculated rapidly. If cartel enforcers had found the cabin, Elena could be walking into an ambush ahead. He needed to warn her, but calling out would reveal their positions to whoever was tracking them. A twig snapped somewhere behind him. A second person. Frank's chances of dealing with multiple hostiles while protecting Elena were diminishing rapidly. He made his decision quickly. Rising slightly, Frank deliberately stepped on a dry branch, creating a sharp crack that echoed through the silent forest. Then he moved, fast and low, through the underbrush, circling toward where he'd seen the first figure. The diversion worked. Frank heard movement as his pursuers oriented toward the noise, giving him precious seconds to gain a tactical advantage. He positioned himself behind a massive oak, waiting as footsteps approached cautiously. A man emerged into view, mid-30s, military-style haircut, wearing hunting camouflage, but moving with the practiced precision of someone with professional training, not your typical hunter. A pistol with a sound suppressor was gripped in his right hand. Frank waited until the man was almost past his position before making his move. One fluid motion. Emerge. From cover, right arm locking around the man's throat, left hand securing the weapon. Federal Marshal, Frank hissed in the man's ear, tightening his chokehold. Drop the weapon. The man struggled briefly before the pistol fell from his grasp. Frank kicked it away, maintaining pressure on the man's airway. Not enough to cause permanent damage, but sufficient to induce compliance. How many of you? Frank demanded, slightly relaxing his grip so the man could speak. 3, the man gasped. 2-man team plus sniper on the ridge. Frank's blood ran cold. A sniper meant high ground, range, and the ability to end this confrontation with a single well-placed shot. He needed to move. Who sent you? Fuck you, the man spat, renewing his struggle. Frank increased pressure on the chokehold until the man went limp, unconscious, but alive. He quickly zip-tied the man's hands and feet, then retrieved the fallen weapon and searched him, finding a radio, a combat knife, and a phone with a satellite connection. The phone might be useful for intelligence, but it could also be tracked. Frank removed the battery and SIM card, pocketing them separately. Now he faced a critical decision. Continue pursuing Elena to warn her, or deal with the remaining threats first. The sniper was the most pressing concern. With high ground and a scope, they could track both Frank and Elena across open terrain. Frank checked his surroundings, identifying the most likely ridgeline for a sniper's nest. About half a mile east, a rocky outcropping would provide excellent sightlines across the valley. Moving with practiced stealth, Frank began making his way toward the ridge, keeping to cover whenever possible. The second ground team member was still unaccounted for, likely continuing the search for Elena. Frank could only hope she remembered her training and stayed hidden. The climb to the ridge was steep and exposed in places. Frank used natural vegetation for concealment, freezing in place whenever instinct warned him he might be in the sniper's sights. Near the top, Frank heard the soft click of a radio transmission, the sniper communicating with their team. Frank edged closer, moving from boulder to boulder until he could make out a figure prone at the edge of the outcropping, a man with a rifle scanning the forest below through a high-powered scope. Frank assessed his options. The sniper had the advantage of position and firepower, but was focused outward, not expecting a threat from behind. Direct confrontation was risky. If the sniper got off a shot, it would not only potentially injure Frank but also alert the third team member to their location. Stealth was the only viable approach. Frank removed his boots, setting them silently aside to allow for quieter movement across the rocky terrain. Then, weapon drawn, he began the final approach, placing each foot with meticulous care, testing weight distribution before committing to each step. 20 feet. 15. 10. The sniper remained oblivious, focused on scanning the forest below. At 5 feet, Frank stepped on a loose pebble, causing a barely audible scrape. The sniper tensed, beginning to turn, but it was too late. Frank closed the distance in 2 swift strides, pressing his weapon against the base of the man's skull. "Don't move," he ordered. "Hands where I can see them." The sniper froze, then slowly raised his hands. "You're making a mistake," he said, voice surprisingly calm. "We're not who you think." "Then who are you?" Frank demanded, relieving the man of his sidearm. "Asset recovery. Private contractors." "Contracted by who?" The sniper remained silent. "Let me guess," Frank continued. "El Serpiente, bounty hunters chasing the reward." A slight shrug. "Just doing a job, man. Nothing personal." It became personal when you came onto my property with weapons. Frank secured the man's hands with restraints from his pack. Where's your third man? The sniper nodded toward the forest. Following your trail, the woman's trail. Miguel's good. At his job. She won't get far. Elena. Frank needed to find her immediately. He secured the sniper to a nearby tree, collected the rifle Andradio, and headed back down the ridge at a controlled but urgent pace. Once back on level ground, Frank keyed the captured radio. Miguel, come in. Silence, then a wary response. Who is this? The man who just took out your team, Frank replied calmly. Your sniper and your partner are secure. You're alone now. A pause. Bullshit. Prove it. Green camo jacket with Texas Rangers patch. Sig Sauer with custom grip. Scar on left eyebrow. Frank described the first man he'd encountered. The radio went silent for several seconds. When Miguel responded, his voice had hardened. Doesn't change anything, old man. I've still got your girl. Frank's heart sank. Let me talk to her. More silence, then Elena's voice, tight with fear but controlled. Frank, I'm okay. The transmission cut off. Miguel's voice returned. Simple trade. The woman for my team, plus safe passage out. Frank considered his options. A direct confrontation was risky with Elena as a hostage, but bounty hunters weren't cartel enforcers. They calculated risk and reward differently. Where? He asked. The clearing. The one she was heading for. 1 hour. Frank checked his watch. I'll be there. Come alone, or the deal's off. The radio went silent. Frank immediately changed direction, not toward the clearing but circling wide around it. If Miguel was taking Elena there, Frank needed to arrive first, assess the terrain, prepare. The clearing was about half a mile away. Frank covered the distance rapidly, moving through the forest with the quiet efficiency of decades of fieldwork. When he reached the edge of the open space, he scanned it methodically, about 50 yards across, surrounded by dense trees, a fallen log near the center. Perfect ambush territory, which meant Frank needed to change the parameters. He circled the clearing, identifying multiple approach routes, and selecting the one Miguel was most likely touse based on the direction he'd been, tracking Elena. Then Frank set up his position, not at the clearing itself, but along the expected approach path, hidden in dense underbrush with clear sightlines in both directions. 40 minutes later, movement caught his attention. Miguel was approaching, Elena walking ahead of him, with her hands apparently bound behind her back. The bounty hunter kept his weapon trained on her, scanning the forest continuously. Frank waited until they were 15 yards from his position before making his move. He stepped onto the path, weapon raised. That's far enough. Miguel froze, pulling Elena closer as a shield. Where are my men? Safe. Secured. Frank kept his aim steady. Let her go, and I'll tell you where to find them. Miguel's laugh was without humor. Not how this works, Marshal. I came for the bounty. 200,000 for you, 100 for her. I'm not leaving empty-handed. Eleanor's eyes locked with Frank's, communicating something he couldn't quite decipher. She looked scared, but strangely determined. The bounty's not worth dying for, Frank countered. And make no mistake, if you harm her, you won't leave these woods alive. Miguel adjusted his grip on Elena, keeping her positioned between himself and Frank. Big talk from an old man. Word is you're quite the legend, El Fantasma. He smirked. But legends die like everyone else. What happened next occurred with stunning rapidity. Elena suddenly dropped her weight, falling to her knees, exactly as she had done in Frank's living room during the initial attack. The move threw Miguel off balance, just enough for Frank to take the shot, a clean hit to the bounty hunter's shoulder, spinning him away from Elena. But Miguel recovered faster than expected, returning fire in Frank's direction. Frank dove for cover as bullets splintered bark inches from his head. Elena, meanwhile, was scrambling away, her hands apparently free. She must have been working on her restraints during the confrontation. She reached the cover of a fallen tree, as Miguel fired again, this time in her direction. Frank emerged from cover just long enough to squeeze off 2 more shots, forcing Miguel to seek shelter behind a tree trunk. The forest echoed with gunfire, birds scattering in panicked flight. Eleanor, stay down, Frank called, moving positions to get a better angle. Miguel's voice carried through the trees. You can't protect her forever, Marshal. Even if you take me down, others will come. The bounty only gets bigger. Then I'll just have to keep collecting bounty hunters, Frank replied, circling to flank Miguel's position. A sudden burst of movement, Miguel breaking cover, making a desperate dash toward where Eleanor was hidden. Frank tracked him with his weapon, firing twice. The first shot missed, but the second caught Miguel on the leg, sending him crashing to the forest floor. Frank approached cautiously, weapon trained on the fallen bounty hunter. Miguel lay on his back, clutching his bleeding leg, his own weapon, just beyond his reach. "It's over," Frank stated, kicking Miguel's gun away. "Elena, you okay?" "I'm okay," she replied, emerging cautiously from behind the fallen tree. She had a cut on her forehead, and her wrists were raw from the restraints, but otherwise appeared unharmed. Miguel laughed through his pain. "You think this is over? This is just the beginning. El Serpiente doesn't forgive, doesn't forget. You're both dead already. You just don't know it yet." Frank secured Miguel's hands with restraints, then applied a field bandage to the leg wound, enough to prevent life-threatening blood loss, but not comfortable. "Why don't you just kill me?" Miguel asked, watching Frank work. "Would be simpler." "Because I'm not them," Frank replied simply. He turned to Elena. "Can you make it back to the cabin?" She nodded, wiping blood from her forehead. "What about them?" She gestured toward Miguel. "We'll call Tom, have him send a team to collect them. They're bounty hunters, not cartel. They'll face charges." Frank helped Elena to her feet. "But it means we need to move. This location is compromised." As they made their way back toward the cabin, Elena processing what had just happened, she finally broke the tense silence. "I thought it was part of the exercise at first," she admitted. "When he grabbed me, I thought you were testing me." She shook her head. "Stupid. Not stupid," Frank corrected. "Inexperienced. There's a difference." He glanced at her. "You did well, keeping your hands free, creating an opportunity. That quick thinking saved both of us." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "I had a good teacher." Back at the cabin, Frank made a secure call to Tom, while Eleanor cleaned the cut on her forehead. Within the hour, arrangements had been made for a Marshal team to collect the bounty hunters and transport them to custody. "We need to move tonight," Frank told Elena as she packed her few belongings. "More will come, and now they know approximately where to look." Elena zipped her bag closed with deliberate finality. "Where to?" "I have another location, less comfortable, more secure." Frank checked his weapon, his expression grim. "But first, we need to understand how they found us. The cabin isn't on any record connected to me or the Marshals." Eleanor froze, a terrible realization dawning. "My phone. When they grabbed me at your house, my personal phone was in my pocket. I never thought... Did they take it?" She nodded miserably. "I didn't even realize until later. It was password protected, but technology can be broken, and the cartel has resources." Frank's expression wasn't accusing, merely calculating. "They must have retrieved your contacts, photos. Something that connected you to me or this location." "I'm so sorry," Elena whispered. "This is my fault." Frank shook his head. "It's their fault. The men who are trying to kill you. Not yours." He checked his watch. "Team will be here in 20 minutes for the prisoners. We need to be gone before they arrive. Won't your people help us?" "Tom's team is clean, but I don't trust the wider department. Not with a leak still unidentified." Frank handed Elena a jacket. "We're better off on our own." As they prepared to leave, Frank took one last look around the cabin, a place that held memories of quieter times with Maria, now forever changed by the violence that had followed them here. "Ready?" he asked Elena, who stood by the door, backpack slung over her shoulder. She nodded, chin raised with the determined expression he was coming to recognize. "Ready?" In the gathering darkness, they slipped away from the cabin, leaving behind the first battlefield of what was rapidly becoming a war. 3 bounty hunters had found them, had come close to succeeding. It was only a matter of time before more arrived. Perhaps cartel enforcers next time, professionals with fewer scruples and more resources. Frank led the way through the darkening forest, Elena close behind. The hunt had truly begun now, roles reversed, in a deadly game where the stakes were measured in lives rather than years behind bars. For the first time since retirement, Frank Castillo felt truly alive again. The familiar tension of pursuit and evasion awakening instincts that had lain dormant for 18 months. But with that awakening came a sobering recognition. Elena's life depended on those instincts remaining sharp, despite the inevitable dulling of Vaj. As they moved through the darkness, Frank's mind was already planning 3 steps ahead. Transportation, safe, house, supplies. The game had changed now. The hunters knew his face, his methods. The element of surprise was gone. Now it was simply a matter of who was better at the hunt, and Frank Castillo had spent a lifetime perfecting that particular skill. The night closed around them like a shroud, concealing their escape from a place that had briefly been sanctuary, now forever marked by the first blood spilled in their desperate flight. Behind them, the cabin stood empty, waiting for whoever would come next. The hunt was on. The abandoned church stood like a forgotten sentinel. On the outskirts of Cartel, a small town about 90 miles southwest of San Antonio, built in the 1920s and left to decay since the 1980s, its stone walls remained solid despite the collapsed roof at the rear of the building. Stained glass windows, those that hadn't been shattered by rocks or weather, filtered the early morning sunlight into fractured patterns across the dusty floor. Not exactly the Ritz, Frank commented as he led Elena through the heavy wooden doors. They had traveled through the night, avoiding main roads, changing vehicles twice. Both were exhausted, but Elena in particular looked ready to collapse. "It's perfect," she replied, her voice reflecting bone-deep weariness, but no complaint. "Nobody would look for us here." "That's the idea." Frank secured the doors behind them, then guided Elena toward the front of the church, where the roof remained intact. He'd prepared this location months ago, not specifically for this situation, but out of the deeply ingrained habits of a man who had spent decades living by the mantra, better to have and not need, than need and not have. Behind the altar, a narrow door led to what had once been the priest's office. Frank had adapted it into a sparse but functional living space. Camping cots, a propane stove, bottled water, non-perishable food, basic medical supplies, and a small arsenal secured in a locked case. "Bathroom facilities are primitive," he admitted, indicating a curtained-off corner. "But there's a creek about 50 yards behind the building for washing up. Water's clean. I've tested it." Elena set down her backpack, examining their new sanctuary with tired eyes. "How many of these places do you have?" "Enough." Frank didn't elaborate. Operational security meant compartmentalization of information, a habit too deeply ingrained to break even with someone he was protecting. "Get some rest. I'll take first watch." For once, Elena didn't argue. She collapsed onto one of the cots, asleep almost instantly, despite the thin mattress and musty surroundings. Frank covered her with a blanket, then moved to the office doorway, where he could monitor both Elena and the church's entrance. The satellite phone in his pocket felt heavy with unspoken concerns. He hadn't contacted Tom since before they fled the cabin, and protocol dictated maintaining communications blackout for at least 24 hours after changing locations. But the nagging suspicion that their security had been more thoroughly compromised than Elena's phone could explain wouldn't leave him. Someone had known where to look for them. Someone with resources, with connections. The bounty hunters had been too precise in their approach, too confident. Frank's thoughts were interrupted by a soft whimper from Elena. Her face had contorted in sleep, hands clenching the blanket. A nightmare. Unsurprising given what she'd been through. He considered waking her, then decided against it. Even troubled sleep was still rest she desperately needed. Instead, he quietly exited the office, checking the church's perimeter before settling into a position with clear sightlines to all potential approaches. The town of Cartel lay to the east, barely visible in the distance, close enough to access supplies if necessary, far enough to provide isolation. The land around the church was mostly scrubland, offering minimal cover for potential attackers, but good visibility for defense. As the sun climbed higher, Frank allowed himself to reflect on their situation. 3 bounty hunters had found them within days of going to ground. The cartel's reach was clearly extensive, their resources substantial. And with each passing day, Elena's testimony at the preliminary hearing drew closer, a testimony that could send Domingo Ortiz to prison for decades and severely damage El Serpiente's operations. Frank had no illusions about what would happen if they were found again. The next attack wouldn't come from bounty hunters looking for a payday. It would be cartel enforcers coming to silence Elena permanently and make an example of the retired Marshal who had dared to interfere. By mid-afternoon, Elena emerged from the office, looking marginally more rested, though the cut on her forehead had developed an angry bruise around it. "How long was I out?" she asked, accepting the bottle of water Frank offered. "About 6 hours. You needed it." She sipped the water, wincing slightly as she stretched stiff muscles. "Any sign of trouble?" "All quiet. I did a perimeter check an hour ago. We're secure for now." Eleanor nodded, settling beside him on a weathered pew. For several minutes they sat in companionable silence, the weight of their circumstances momentarily balanced by the simple relief of having survived the first attack. "Tell me something," Eleanor said finally. "Why are you doing this? You could have handed me off to the Marshals, gone back to your retirement. Why put yourself at risk?" Frank considered the question, looking out through a broken window at the Texas landscape beyond. "Hard to explain," he admitted. "Part of it's the job. Once a marshal, always a marshal. We don't abandon witnesses." He paused. "But it's more than that. I've spent my life hunting people who hurt others, who think they're above consequences. Ortiz, El Serpiente. They represent everything I fought against for 32 years. So, it's personal, isn't it for you?" Frank countered. Elena nodded slowly. "When I saw what they were doing, the money, the drugs, the casual way they discussed removing problems, I knew I couldn't walk away. My father was killed by men like them. Just an innocent bystander, wrong place, wrong time." Her jaw tightened. "If I don't testify, if I let them silence me, then nothing ever changes." Frank studied her, seeing beyond the exhaustion and fear to the core of determination that had brought her into this fight. "That's why I'm doing this," he said simply. "Because you deserve the chance to finish what you started, and because some fights are worth the risk." The moment was interrupted by the satellite phone vibrating in Frank's pocket. He checked the display. "Tom Reyes. Castillo," he answered, stepping away from Elena for privacy. "Frank, where the hell are you?" Tom's voice was tight with concern. "We found the cabin, the bounty hunters. What happened?" "They found us. We relocated." Frank kept his language deliberately vague, decades of caution, preventing specifics even, on a secure line. "Your team got the prisoners?" "All 3 in custody, though they're not talking. We're working on them." Tom paused. "But that's not why I'm calling. We've got a problem." Frank's instincts immediately sharpened. "What kind of problem?" "The kind that means you were right about a leak. The kind that means this goes higher than we thought." Tom lowered his voice. "The U.S. Attorney's Office wants Elena brought in. Officially, it's for additional prep before the preliminary hearing. Unofficially, Frank, I don't trust it. The request came through channels that don't make sense. Who specifically is asking for her?" "Assistant U.S. Attorney James Hardwick. He's new to the case, just assigned last week. But here's the thing. He's insisting on the transfer happening tomorrow. Minimal security detail. Very specific protocols that would make you vulnerable during transport." Frank processed this information, connecting it with his existing suspicions. "Sounds like a setup. That's my read too. But I'm being pressured to comply. Provide your location." "What did you tell them?" "That I lost contact with you after the cabin incident. I'm taking heat for it, but I'm holding the line." Tom's frustration was evident. "But Frank, this is big. If the U.S. Attorney's Office is compromised, then nowhere in the system is safe," Frank finished grimly. "We stay off-grid." "I figured you'd say that." "Listen, I did some digging on Hardwick. Nothing obvious, but he clerked for Judge Raymond Vasquez back in 2010. Vasquez? Frank's mind immediately made the connection. Ramon Vasquez's brother. The same. Ramon being Ortiz's former attorney before he mysteriously drowned in Lake Travis. The pieces were aligning with disturbing clarity. That's a thin connection, but worth following. I'm on it, but quietly. In the meantime, you need to know, they're expanding the search. Border Patrol, state troopers, local PDs all have your descriptions. Officially, it's to ensure witness safety. Unofficially, they're flushing us out, Frank concluded. How much time do we have before the preliminary hearing? 17 days. But Frank, with this level of heat, I don't see how you make it that long without being discovered. Frank glanced toward Elena, who was watching him with obvious concern. We'll make it. Keep digging on Hardwick. And Tom, watch your back. If they know we're communicating, I'm being careful. Next check-in. Same protocol, tomorrow night. After ending the call, Frank returned to Elena, weighing how much to share. She deserved the truth, but he also needed her focused, not paralyzed by the scope of what they faced. Bad news, she asked, reading his expression. Complications, Frank replied, carefully. The search is expanding, and there may be pressure coming from places we didn't expect. Eleanor's eyes widened slightly. The U.S. Attorney's Office? They're the ones I've been working with on my testimony. What can you tell me about Assistant U.S. Attorney James Hardwick? She frowned, thinking. Not much. I only met him once, briefly. He's new to the case. Took over after Asa Pearson was reassigned. She paused. He seemed intense, very focused on details of what I saw. Who else might have known I was there that day? Frank nodded, filing away this information. For now, we assume that official channels are compromised. West stay off-grid, avoid all contact except with Tom, and prepare for the preliminary hearing our own way. And if they find us before then? They won't, Frank stated with a confidence he didn't entirely feel. But we need to be smarter, more careful, starting with better understanding what we're up against. He retrieved a laptop from his supplies, not connected to any network, but loaded with case files Tom had provided before they went on the run. I need to know everything, Elena. Every detail of what you saw, every name you heard, every face you remember. Something in your testimony has them scared enough to burn high-level contacts. We need to figure out what. For the next several hours, they meticulously reconstructed Elena's experience at the money-counting house. Frank, drawing on decades of witness interviews, guided her through memory enhancement techniques, helping her recall details she hadn't recognized as significant. It wasn't just Ortiz and the distributors, Elena realized as they worked. There was another man there, well-dressed, not Cartel. They deferred to him, showed him financial records. Can you describe him? Older, maybe 60s. Silver hair, expensive suit. They called him El Patron, or sometimes El Juez. Frank went still. El Juez, the judge. Elena nodded. I thought it was just a nickname. Maybe, maybe not. Frank's mind raced through possibilities. Did you mention this man to the prosecutors? Yes, of course. They said they'd look into it, but focused mostly on Ortiz. She frowned. Wait, you don't think... I think we've found what they're afraid of, Frank said grimly. If El Juez is who I suspect, a sitting judge with cartel connections, your testimony threatens not just Ortiz but an entire system of corruption. No wonder they're pulling out all the stops. The implications were staggering. A compromised judge could have been quietly facilitating cartel operations for years, dismissing cases, influencing sentencing, providing intelligence on law enforcement operations. What do we do? Eleanor asked, the weight of this revelation evident in her voice. We adjust our strategy, Frank replied, already formulating a new plan. If we're right about this, going to the preliminary hearing as scheduled would be walking into a trap. We need to find a way to get your testimony to people we can trust, with evidence that can't be ignored. As darkness fell, they continued working. Frank pushing Elena to remember every detail of the mysterious El Juez while fortifying their position in the abandoned church. The stakes had escalated beyond protecting a single witness. They were now potentially uncovering a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the justice system. Frank set up basic early warning systems around the perimeter, tripwires, connected to small bells, strategically positioned reflective surfaces to detect approaching headlights. Not sophisticated, but effective enough to prevent surprise attacks. By midnight, exhaustion had caught up with them both. Frank insisted Elena take another rest period while he maintained watch. Sitting near a window overlooking the approach to the church, he cleaned his weapon with practiced movements, mind working through contingencies and escape routes. The revelation about El Juez had changed everything. What had begun as a straightforward witness protection assignment had evolved into something far more dangerous, and potentially far more significant. If they could identify this judge, prove his connection to the cartel, the implications would ripple throughout the entire justice system. Frank found himself thinking of colleagues who had been killed in the line of duty, operations that had, inexplicably, gone wrong, cases that had mysteriously fallen apart. How many had been the result of this corruption? How many lives had been lost because justice had been compromised? The familiar cold resolve that had driven him throughout his career settled in his chest. This was no longer just about keeping Eleanor alive until the trial. This was about exposing a cancer that had infected the very system he'd served faithfully for 3 decades. As the night deepened, Frank maintained his vigil, a lone sentinel guarding not just a witness, but perhaps the key to restoring integrity to a corrupted system. The hunt had taken on new meaning. Dawn broke with the distant rumble of thunder, promising storms by midday. Frank, who had maintained watch through the night with only brief periods of rest, observed the gathering clouds with practical concern. Rain would provide additional cover, but could also limit visibility and mobility if they needed to move quickly. Elena emerged from the office space looking remarkably refreshed despite their circumstances. She'd washed in the creek at first light, her hair still damp, and had changed into fresh clothes from the supplies Frank had stored. "You should get some rest," she told him, taking in the evident fatigue in his posture. "I can keep watch for a few hours." Frank hesitated, ingrained habit warring with practical necessity. He hadn't slept properly since before the attack at the cabin, and exhaustion dulled reflexes and judgment, luxuries they couldn't afford to compromise. "Wake me immediately if you see or hear anything unusual," he finally conceded. "Anything. At all, no matter how insignificant it seems." Elena nodded solemnly. "I promise." Frank showed her the basic defensive positions he'd established, the sightlines to watch, the potential approach routes that required special vigilance. Then, reluctantly, he retired to the office space, leaving the door ajar so he could respond quickly if needed. Despite his concerns, sleep claimed him almost instantly, the practiced ability of a career lawman to rest when opportunity allowed. His subconscious remained partially alert, processing sounds and shifts in the environment, ready to snap to full awareness at the first sign of threat. 3 hours later, Frank awoke to the soft patter of rain against the stone walls. He rose immediately, body protesting, but mind clear. Moving to the office doorway, he found Eleanor exactly where he'd left her, maintaining careful watch over the approaches to the church. "Anything?" he asked, checking his watch. "Just past noon." She shook her head. "All quiet, just the storm moving in." Frank nodded, retrieving a protein bar from their supplies and washing it down with water. Not gourmet dining, but functional. As he ate, he considered their next move. "We need to confirm our suspicions about El Juez," he said, joining Elena by the window. "If we're right, it changes our approach entirely." "How do we do that from here? We can't exactly access court records or run background checks." "No," Frank agreed. "But we have an asset who can. It's time to bring Tom more fully into the loop." The satellite phone, however, remained silent when Frank attempted to call. No connection available, whether due to the storm or more concerning, causes he couldn't determine. "Could be the weather," he said, though his expression betrayed his unease. "We'll try again when the storm passes." The rain intensified throughout the afternoon, turning the dusty ground around the church into mud and reducing visibility to less than 100 yards. Frank used the enforced isolation to continue working with Elena on her testimony, focusing particularly on any details that might help identify El Juez. "There was something else," Elena said, brow furrowed in concentration. "A name I heard mentioned. They were discussing someone who had become a problem, needed to be handled." Ortiz seemed angry about it. "Do you remember the name?" "Reyes," she said, then looked up sharply. "Like your friend Tom?" Frank went still. "Tom Reyes, they mentioned him specifically?" Elena's eyes widened. "I didn't make the connection until now. They just said Reyes was asking too many questions, getting too close." She paled. "Oh God, if they know about him." Frank's mind raced through implications. If Ortiz had identified Tom as a threat weeks ago, before Elena had even gone into witness protection, "The leak," he said softly. "It goes deeper than we thought." The satellite phone in his pocket suddenly vibrated. Tom, according to the display. Frank hesitated, a cold suspicion forming. "What is it?" Elena asked, reading his expression. "Maybe..." "Nothing." Frank accepted the call but said nothing, waiting. "Frank?" Tom's voice, tense. "Are you there? We've got a situation." "What kind of situation?" Frank kept his tone neutral, non-committal. "I've been compromised. They know I've been helping you. I had to leave the office, go dark. The sound of traffic in the background, suggesting Tom was on the move. They're closing in, Frank. Hardwick convinced the ASAC that you've gone rogue, possibly even working with the cartel to silence the witness. Where are you now? Frank asked, still careful to reveal nothing. Secure location. Listen, I've got something on El Juez. It's Judge Vasquez, Raymond Vasquez. I found financial records, offshore accounts. He's been on Ortiz's payroll for years. Exactly. What Frank had suspected. Too perfect, in fact. That's good work, Tom. How'd you find the financial records? A slight hesitation. Confidential informant. Someone inside Ortiz's organization wanting to cut a deal. Frank made eye contact with Elena, giving a subtle shake of his head to indicate something was wrong. Must be a pretty high-level informant to have access to those kinds of records. The highest. Listen, Frank, we need to meet. I've got documents, evidence that will blow this whole thing open, but it's not safe to transmit. I can come to you. That's risky, Frank replied, mind working rapidly. How do I know you weren't followed? Or that this cal isn't being traced? Jesus, Frank, it's me. Tom's voice held a note of injured pride. 30 years, partner. You think I'd betray you? I think 30 years means you'd know exactly what I'm going to ask next. Frank countered. What was the name of the fugitive in Laredo? The one with the parrot. A pause. Slightly too long. Rodriguez. Carlos Rodriguez. Frank's jaw tightened. The correct answer was Martinez. Miguel Martinez, whose macaw had bitten Tom during the arrest. A story they'd laughed about for years after. Right, Frank said, maintaining his tone. Good memory. Let me think about the meeting. I'll call you back. He ended the call, meeting Elena's questioning gaze with grim confirmation. That wasn't Tom? No. Or if it was, he was speaking under duress. Frank was already moving, gathering essential supplies. Either way, we've been compromised. We need to move. Now. How? Elena gestured toward the window, where rain continued to pour down in sheets. We're in the middle of nowhere, in a storm. Which provides good cover, Frank replied, not slowing. His preparations. We leave on foot cross-country. There's an old ranch about 3 miles south. Should be abandoned this time of year. We can regroup there, try to make actual contact with Tom. Elena began packing without further question, understanding the urgency. Within minutes, they had condensed their essential supplies into 2 backpacks, leaving behind anything that would slow them down. As Frank did a final check of their preparations, Elena approached him with worried eyes. If that wasn't Tom, does that mean he's been captured? Or worse? We can't know for sure, Frank admitted, but Tom's smart, experienced. If he suspected he was compromised, he would have contingencies. He hesitated, then added more gently, we have to focus on what we can control right now, our survival. They donned rain gear from Frank's supplies and prepared to move out the back of the church, away from the main road. Frank made one final sweep of their temporary sanctuary, ensuring they left nothing that could provide clues to their next destination. At the door, Frank paused, hand on Elena's arm. Stay close. Move like I move. If I say drop, you drop instantly. If we get separated, head south-southwest. Keep the setting sun on your right. Understand? She nodded, face set with determination despite the fear evident in her eyes. They stepped out into the downpour, immediately soaked despite the rain gear. Visibility was poor. Good for concealment, challenging for navigation. Frank led the way with confidence born of decades tracking fugitives through far worse conditions, setting a pace Elena could maintain while covering ground quickly. The muddy terrain made for difficult progress, every step requiring careful attention to maintain footing. They kept to the natural contours of the land, using arroyos and brush for cover when possible, avoiding exposed ridgelines where they might be silhouetted against the sky. After about a mile, Frank called a brief halt beneath the shelter of a large mesquite tree. Both were breathing hard from the exertion of moving through mud and brush. You're doing well, he told Elena, offering her water from his canteen. How's the ankle? He'd noticed her slight limp developing over the past quarter mile. I'll manage, she replied, accepting the water gratefully. Just twisted it a bit back there. Frank was about to suggest adjusting their pace when a sound caught his attention, barely perceptible beneath the rain, but unmistakable to his trained ear, the distant rumble of engines. Down, he ordered, pulling Elena into a prone position, beside him in the mud. Vehicles, at least 2. coming from the direction of the church. Elena went perfectly still, following his lead as they pressed themselves into the ground, using the brush for concealment. Within moments, the sound grew clearer. Heavy vehicles moving slowly along the crude track that led past their position toward the abandoned church. Through the curtain of rain, Frank caught glimpses of black SUVs, at least 3, moving with deliberate purpose. Law enforcement would have used lights to announce their presence. These vehicles moved like hunters stalking prey. "They found us," Elena whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "They found where we were," Frank corrected. "Not where we are, that's an important difference." They remained motionless until the vehicles had passed, continuing toward the church. Frank knew they had minutes at most before their absence was discovered and the search redirected. "Change of plans," he said as they carefully rose. "They'll expect us to head for roads, transportation. We go deeper into the brush instead, work our way toward the Nueces River. It's about 2 miles east. And then? Then we follow it north. There's a highway bridge about 10 miles up. We can figure out transportation there." They resumed their trek, now moving with greater urgency despite the challenging conditions. Frank set a zigzagging course, deliberately avoiding direct lines that pursuers might anticipate. The rain continued, unabated, turning even slight inclines into treacherous slopes of slick mud. Elena stumbled once, crying out softly as her injured ankle gave way. Frank caught her before she fell, supporting her weight. "I'm okay," she insisted, though pain was evident in her face. "I can keep going." Frank assessed her quickly. The ankle was swelling but not badly sprained. "Let me help you," he said, pulling her arm across his shoulders to take some weight off the injury. "Lean on me when you need to." They continued this way for another half-mile, making slower progress but still moving steadily eastward. The sound of vehicles had faded, but Frank harbored no illusions about the respite being permanent. Once the church was found empty, the search would intensify, likely with aerial support once the weather cleared. They had just begun descending into a shallow ravine when Frank froze, signaling Elena to silence. Voices carried on the wind, faint but unmistakable, and coming from ahead of them, not behind. "They've flanked us," he whispered, immediately altering course to move perpendicular to the new threat. "Must have split their forces, anticipated our route." Elena's eyes widened. "How? How could they know which way we'd go?" "Someone who knows my tactics," Frank replied grimly. "Someone who's studied how I operate." The implications hung between them, unspoken but clear. Someone close to Frank, familiar with his methods. The betrayal ran deeper than they had imagined. They pushed into denser brush, the thorny vegetation tearing at their clothes, but providing better concealment. Frank's mind raced through diminishing options. The original plan was compromised. The backup plan was blocked. They needed a third alternative quickly. A sudden shout from behind confirmed their worst fears. They'd been spotted. Orders were called out in Spanish, the unmistakable sound of pursuit crashing through underbrush. "Run!" Frank commanded, taking Elena's hand. "Now!" They abandoned stealth for speed, crashing through the brush toward a stand of trees about 200 yards ahead. Elena's injury slowed them, but adrenaline compensated, pushing her beyond normal endurance. Gunfire erupted behind them, warning shots, intentionally high, designed to stop them rather than kill. At least for now. Frank knew that could change, in an instant if they appeared likely to escape. They reached the trees as another volley of shots kicked up mud around their feet. Frank pulled Elena behind the largest trunk, drawing his weapon. "Keep going," he told her. "I'll cover you. Catch up." "No!" Elena grabbed his arm. "We stay together. You said so yourself." "Elena, I'm not leaving you," she stated flatly, the determination in her eyes brooking no argument. The decision was made for them, as figures emerged from the brush on 3 sides, men in tactical gear, moving with professional discipline, weapons trained on their position, at least 6 visible, likely more in reserve. Frank assessed their situation with cold clarity. They were surrounded, outnumbered, with compromised mobility due to Elena's injury. Fighting meant near certain death for both of them. "Federal Marshal," he called out, identifying himself while keeping Elena behind him. "The woman is under my protection. Any harm to her will be met with the full force of federal law." A laugh answered him as one of the men stepped forward, not a cartel enforcer, but a face Frank recognized immediately despite the years that had passed. "Hello, Frank." said Michael Taggart, former US Marshal and Frank's one-time partner before Tom. Been a long time. Frank maintained his aim, shock concealed behind decades of professional control. Mike, figured you'd still be enjoying retirement in Phoenix, golfing, fishing, not working for drug cartels. Taggart shrugged, seemingly unperturbed by the accusation. Plans change. Pensions don't stretch as far as they used to. He gestured toward the surrounding men. Why don't you put the gun down, Frank? For old time's sake. Make this easy on yourself. Where's Tom? Frank demanded. What have you done with him? Tom's fine. For now. Taggart's expression hardened. His future health depends entirely on how cooperative you decide to be. The pieces aligned with sickening clarity. Mike Taggart, who had retired 6 years ago after a distinguished career, who knew Frank's tactics, tendencies, and training intimately, who had access to Marshal's service resources, protocols, and personnel through old connections. The inside man. The leak they'd been searching for. How long? Frank asked, gun still raised despite the futility of their position. How long have you been working for Ortiz? Does it matter? Taggart countered. Put the weapon down, Frank. There's nowhere to run. The woman testifies as instructed, minimizing certain aspects, omitting certain names, and everyone lives. Simple as that. Elena stepped forward slightly, still behind Frank but making herself visible. And if I refuse? Taggart's smile was cold. Then we only need your body to send a message to other potential witnesses. Either way, Ortiz wins. His gaze returned to Frank. Last chance, old friend. Gun down, nice and easy. Frank's mind calculated. Rapidly, seeking any avenue of escape, and finding none. They were completely surrounded, with no realistic chance of fighting their way out. Elena was injured, making a run for it equally impossible. Sometimes, the experienced part of his mind counseled, the right tactical move is surrender, live to fight another day. If I cooperate, Frank said carefully, I want your word that Elena remains unharmed, and Tom too. Of course, Taggart replied smoothly. This isn't personal, Frank, it's just business. Slowly, deliberately, Frank lowered his weapon. Elena, stand down, he said quietly. We're going to cooperate for now. The disappointment and fear in her eyes cut him deeply, but he gave an almost imperceptible nod, a silent communication that this wasn't over, merely delayed. Taggart signaled his men, who moved in quickly to secure them both. Frank's weapons were confiscated, his hands zip-tied behind his back. Elena received similar treatment, though one of the men handled her roughly enough to elicit a pained gasp as her injured ankle was jostled. Careful with her, Frank warned, earning himself a backhand across the face from one of the guards. Still giving orders, Frank? Taggart laughed. Some things never change. He checked his watch. We've got a long drive ahead. Mr. Ortiz is eager to meet the witness who's caused so much trouble. He looked at Eleanor with cold assessment, and the marshal who thought he could stand in our way. They were led back through the brush toward waiting vehicles, the same black SUVs Frank had spotted earlier. The rain had finally begun to slacken, small patches of blue appearing in the western sky. As they walked, Frank carefully observed their captors, counting personnel, noting weapons, identifying the chain of command. Old habits, automatic even in defeat. Eleanor stayed close to him, her composure remarkable despite their dire circumstances. When they reached the vehicles, she was separated from Frank, directed toward a different SUV. She stays with me, Frank demanded, receiving another blow for his trouble. Not up to you anymore, Taggart replied. Don't worry, she'll be treated well, as long as she remains compliant. The look that passed between them contained decades of history, from partners who had once trusted each other with their lives, to enemies standing on opposite sides of a moral chasm that could never be bridged. As Frank was shoved into the back of an SUV, hands secured painfully behind him, he caught a final glimpse of Eleanor being loaded into a vehicle ahead. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, he tried to convey everything he couldn't say aloud, that this wasn't over, that he hadn't given up, that somehow he would find a way. The door slammed shut, and darkness enveloped him as the convoy began to move. Through the tinted windows, the Texas landscape rolled past, the storm clouds finally breaking apart to reveal late afternoon's sunlight. Frank Castillo, who had spent a lifetime hunting fugitives, now found himself the captive, betrayed by a former brother-in-arms, separated from the witness he had sworn to protect, heading toward an uncertain but undoubtedly dangerous fate. But as the vehicles pushed northward, Frank's mind was already working, analyzing, planning. Taggart had made one critical mistake in this encounter. He had left Frank alive, and as countless fugitives had learned over 3 decades, underestimating Frank Castillo was almost always a fatal error. Darkness had fallen by the time the convoy reached its destination, a sprawling ranch compound approximately 30 miles north of Laredo. As the SUV carrying Frank passed through heavy security gates, he catalogued details with practiced precision. 3 guard posts, motion sensors along the perimeter fence, at least a dozen armed personnel visible, cameras covering all approaches, a fortress designed to keep people out or in. The vehicle pulled to a stop in a courtyard flanked by a Spanish-style hacienda on one side and what appeared to be converted stables on the other. Frank was roughly extracted from the back seat, his muscles stiff and painful after hours of confinement with his hands secured behind him. "Where's Eleanor?" he demanded as Taggart approached, flanked by 2 guards. "Being taken care of," Taggart replied dismissively. "Your concern should be your own situation right now." Frank was marched toward the converted stables, which he now recognized as having been transformed into holding cells. The construction was solid. Concrete floors, reinforced doors, small windows set too high to reach and too narrow to pass through. Professional work, not makeshift. "Nice setup," Frank commented, continuing to gather intelligence even as a prisoner. "Ortiz keeps a dedicated detention facility on his ranch? That's confident, even for a cartel leader." Taggart smirked. "This isn't Ortiz's property, at least not on paper. It belongs to a subsidiary of a corporation owned by a holding company registered in the Cayman Islands." He pushed open one of the heavy doors. "Butiés, El Serpiente believes in being prepared for all contingencies." Frank was shoved into the cell, a sparse space containing nothing but a metal cot, bolted to the floor, and a stainless steel toilet in the corner. No sheets, no pillow, nothing that could be fashioned into a weapon or used for escape. "Your accommodations for the night," Taggart announced. "I'd make yourself comfortable. Tomorrow will be eventful." "Where's Tom?" Frank asked before Taggart could close the door. "Is he here too?" Something flickered across Taggart's face, an emotion Frank couldn't quite identify. "No, Tom's elsewhere. His situation depends entirely on how cooperative the witness decides to be." "His name is Tom Reyes," Frank said deliberately. "You were at his wedding. Your godfather to his oldest son. Does that mean anything to you anymore, Mike?" Taggart's expression hardened. "What means something to me is securing my future. The Marshal's pension doesn't exactly set you up for the golden years, as you'll find out." He gestured around the compound. "This, on the other hand, Ortiz pays well for loyalty. Is that what you call it?" Frank's voice was quiet but cutting. "When did it start? Before retirement? Were you selling information while still wearing the badge?" A flash of anger crossed Taggart's face. "You don't get to judge me, Frank. You with your perfect record, your commendations, your reputation as El Fantasma. Some of us didn't have it so easy. We all had the same choice, Mike. Every day we put on the badge." Taggart stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You know what 32 years of service got me? A handshake, a plaque, and medical benefits that barely cover my wife's cancer treatments. Ortiz offered me a way out, and all I had to do was occasionally provide information on witness relocations." His jaw tightened. "Easy choice when you're watching the woman you love suffer because you can't afford the experimental treatment insurance won't cover." Frank absorbed this information without visible reaction, though inwardly, the revelation added layers of complexity to his former partner's betrayal. Not a simple case of greed, but desperation, perhaps the most dangerous motivation of all. "And how many witnesses died because of that information?" Frank asked quietly. Taggart's expression shuttered. "Get some rest, Frank. You'll need it." He stepped back, preparing to close the door. "For what it's worth, I argued for keeping you alive. Others wanted to end this more permanently. Why didn't they?" A thin smile. "Ortiz wants to meet the legendary Marshal who's caused so much trouble. After that meeting," Taggart shrugged. "I wouldn't count on retirement benefits." The door closed with a heavy thud, locks engaging with mechanical precision. Frank listened to Taggart's footsteps receding, then carefully surveyed his cell. No obvious weaknesses, no convenient air ducts or loose floor tiles like in the movies, just solid construction designed specifically to prevent escape. Only after confirming he was truly alone did Frank allow himself to address the physical discomfort of his situation. The zip ties securing his wrists had cut into his skin during the journey, leaving painful abrasions. His shoulders ached from the unnatural position, and the blow he'd received earlier had left a throbbing pain along his jawline. None of that mattered. Physical discomfort could be compartmentalized, pushed aside to focus on what truly mattered: finding Elena, locating Tom, and somehow turning this catastrophic setback into an opportunity. Frank settled onto the cot, mind working methodically, through what he knew. The ranch was heavily guarded, but not impenetrable. Taggart was compromised, but complicated, not purely mercenary, which meant potential leverage. Elena was still alive, her testimony valuable, as long as she agreed to modify it according to cartel demands. And tomorrow would bring a meeting with Ortiz himself, a key player, rather than a subordinate. Each fact represented a potential advantage, if leveraged correctly. Hours passed, marked only by periodic checks from guards who peered through the small viewing window in the door. Frank used the time to rest his body while keeping his mind active, running through scenarios, contingency plans, potential opportunities that might present themselves. Shortly after midnight, the sound of approaching footsteps drew his attention. Not the heavy tread of guards, but lighter steps, accompanied by the gentle clink of dishes. The viewing window slid open, and a young woman's face appeared. Hispanic, perhaps 20, with wary eyes that darted nervously down the corridor before focusing on Frank. "Señor," she whispered, "I bring food." The door opened just enough for her to slide a tray through, a bowl of bean soup, tortillas, water. Simple fare, but Frank recognized the humanitarian gesture for what it was. "Gracias," he replied quietly. "Como te llamas?" The woman hesitated. "Lucia," she finally answered. "Lucia, have you seen another prisoner? A woman brought in today." Lucia's eyes widened slightly, glancing nervously behind her again. "La testigo, yes, she is in the main house." Frank kept his voice gentle, non-threatening. "Is she hurt?" "No, señor. They treat her well, for now." Lucia's expression conveyed what remained unspoken, that situation could change rapidly. "I must go. If they catch me talking—" "One more thing," Frank pressed, sensing she might be sympathetic. "Do you know what's planned for tomorrow?" Lucia bit her lip. "El Serpiente arrives in the morning. There will be a meeting." She lowered her voice further. "They say the witness must change her story or—" She drew a finger across her throat in universal symbolism. Frank nodded grimly. "Thank you, Lucia." She began to close the door, then paused. "My brother," she said softly. "He was killed by these men 3 years ago. Just a student, in the wrong place." Her eyes met Frank's, a flash of defiance visible. "Not everyone here serves." "Willingly, Marshal." The door closed before Frank could respond, locks re-engaging. He moved to the tray, appreciating the small kindness, while recognizing it might also represent an opportunity. Allies within the compound, however tentative, could prove invaluable. The soup was surprisingly good, the first real food he'd had since their hasty breakfast at the abandoned church. As he ate, Frank continued planning, folding this new information into his developing strategy. Elena was in the main house, apparently unharmed. Ortiz himself would arrive tomorrow, and at least one staff member harbored resentment toward the cartel. Small advantages, but in Frank's experience, freedom or captivity, life or death, often hinged on such details. After finishing the meal, Frank stretched out on the cot, forcing his body to rest despite the discomfort and the urgency of their situation. Years of fieldwork had taught him to seize whatever opportunity for recovery presented itself. Exhaustion dulled reflexes and clouded judgment, potentially fatal impairments, when the moment to act finally arrived. He was awakened before dawn by the cell door crashing open. 2 guards entered, one training a weapon on him, while the other roughly hauled him to his feet. "Time to get presentable for the boss," the armed guard announced with a smirk. "Can't meet El Serpiente looking like shit, can you?" Frank was marched to a washroom facility attached to the stable block, basic but functional with shower stalls and sinks. His restraints were removed only after a clear warning that any resistance would result in immediate consequences. Fresh clothes waited on a bench, not his own, but clean jeans and a button-down shirt that approximately fit. 15 minutes, the guard instructed. Then we come in, whether you're decent or not. The hot water was a luxury Frank hadn't expected but gratefully utilized, washing away days of grime and sweat while simultaneously assessing his physical condition. Bruises from the initial attack at the cabin had faded to yellowish shadows. New injuries from their capture were superficial, painful, but not debilitating. His body, despite the protests of age, remained functional, ready. As he dressed in the provided clothes, Frank noted the increased activity outside. Vehicles arriving, voice calling orders, the compound awakening to prepare for its VIP visitor. Through a small window, he glimpsed additional security personnel taking positions, their weapons and demeanor suggesting professional training rather than typical cartel muscle. Exactly on schedule, the guards returned, securing his hands once more, this time in front rather than behind his back, a small mercy, before escorting him across the courtyard toward the main house. The hacienda was impressive. Colonial architecture, with modern security enhancements discreetly integrated into the structure. Frank counted cameras, noted access points, identified security measures with the automatic assessment of decades in law enforcement. The interior was elegantly appointed, displaying wealth without ostentation. Artwork, antiques, custom furnishings that spoke of refined taste rather than mere expenditure. He was led to what appeared to be a study or private office at the rear of the house. Large windows overlooked manicured grounds, a pool area, and stables beyond. The security presence was heavier here, with armed men stationed at regular intervals throughout the house and visible on the grounds outside. "Wait here," his escort instructed, leaving Frank alone in the room under the watchful eye of 2 guards stationed by the door. The minutes stretched into nearly an hour, a psychological tactic Frank recognized, making the prisoner wait, extending uncertainty, establishing control. He remained standing, using the time to continue cataloging details of his surroundings, potential weapons, possible exits, sight lines from windows to the grounds beyond. Finally, the door opened to admit 3 individuals, Michael Taggart, looking uncomfortable in a suit that suggested an attempt at corporate respectability, Victor Salazar, whom Frank recognized from intelligence briefings as Ortiz's right-hand man, and Elena, her face pale but composed, dressed in what appeared to be borrowed clothes similar to Frank's. Their eyes met across the room, a silent communication passing between them. She was unharmed, though the slight favoring of her injured ankle remained noticeable. More importantly, the determination in her expression hadn't dimmed. "Frank," she acknowledged, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "You okay?" he asked, simply. She nodded. "So far." Further conversation was prevented by the arrival of the man they had been waiting for. Domingo Ortiz entered without fanfare, a surprise to those expecting cartel flamboyance. In his mid-50s, he was of medium height, with salt and pepper hair cropped short, wearing an expensive but understated suit that might have belonged to any successful businessman. Only his eyes betrayed his true nature: cold, assessing, devoid of empathy. "Marshal Castillo," Ortiz greeted him, his English perfect with only the slightest accent. "I've heard much about you. El Fantasma, the man who never lost his prey." He gestured toward a seating area. "Please, sit. We have matters to discuss." Frank remained standing. "I prefer to stand." Ortiz smiled thinly. "As you wish." He settled into an armchair, gesturing for Elena to sit opposite him. After a moment's hesitation, she complied. "I'll be direct, Marshal," Ortiz continued. "As I understand, you're a man who appreciates clarity. Ms. Vasquez has found herself in an unfortunate situation, a witness to matters that don't concern her. Normally, such situations resolve themselves naturally." His implication was clear. However, circumstances have evolved, and we now find ourselves at an impasse. "No impasse," Frank replied evenly. "Elena testifies truthfully about what she saw, and justice takes its course. Very simple." Ortiz's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Justice. Such a malleable concept, don't you think? What's just about a system where judges can be bought, prosecutors intimidated, evidence manipulated?" He leaned forwards lightly. "You've served that system faithfully for decades, Marshal. Tell me honestly, Do you truly believe justice prevails more often than not? A philosopher's question from a criminal's mouth. Frank didn't take the bait. I believe in the rule of law. I believe actions have consequences, even for men who think themselves untouchable. Admirable principles, Ortiz acknowledged with mock solemnity. But principles don't protect families, do they? They don't save lives when hard choices must be made. He turned his attention to Elena. Ms. Vasquez, I've had an enlightening conversation with my attorney this morning regarding your testimony. It seems there may be a misunderstanding about what you witnessed at my property. Elena's chin lifted slightly. I know exactly what I saw. Perhaps, Ortiz conceded, but memory is fallible, influenced by stress, by fear. Perhaps you saw men counting money, a legitimate business transaction. Perhaps you overheard discussion of distribution, referring to legal imports, not narcotics. Perhaps the name El Juez referred not to Judge Vasquez, but to a business associate who arbitrates disputes. His voice remained conversational, almost gentle, but the threat underneath was unmistakable. With such reasonable doubts about your recollections, your testimony becomes problematic for the prosecution, certainly not enough to sustain serious charges. You want me to lie, Elena stated flatly. I want you to reconsider what you believe you saw, Ortiz corrected smoothly. In exchange for which certain guarantees can be made, he gestured toward Frank. The Marshal's freedom, for instance, and his continued good health. Elena's eyes flicked to Frank, uncertainty visible for the first time. There's more, Ortiz continued, sensing her wavering. Your family in Ciudad Juarez, your grandmother, your cousins, they could be brought safely to the United States, provided with new identities, comfortable living arrangements. He spread his hands. All this for simply acknowledging that what you witnessed may have been misinterpreted. Frank watched the conflict play across Elena's face, the principled determination to testify truthfully warring with fear for those she cared about. It was the devil's bargain, justice sacrificed for the protection of innocence. Don't do it, Elena, Frank said quietly. If you compromise now, it never ends. There will always be another threat, another demand. Ortiz's expression hardened momentarily, before smoothing back into practiced urbanity. The Marshal offers admirable but impractical advice. He believes in systems and institutions, ideal in realities. He turned back to Elena. Consider carefully, Ms. Vasquez. The preliminary hearing is in 2 weeks. You have until tomorrow morning to make your decision. He rose, adjusting his suit jacket with the precision of a man accustomed to controlling every detail of his environment. In the meantime, you'll both be treated as guests, with appropriate security measures, of course. I suggest you use this time to discuss the practicalities of your situation. His gaze settled on Frank. Marshal, perhaps you could enlighten Ms. Vasquez about the realities of witness protection, the statistics on witnesses who testify against cartels and their subsequent life expectancy, the constant looking over one's shoulder, the isolation from family and friends. Without waiting for a response, Ortiz exited the room, followed by Salazar. Taggart lingered momentarily, expression unreadable, before following his employers. The door closed behind them, leaving Frank and Eleanor alone except for the 2 silent guards. For several moments, neither spoke. Then Eleanor rose, moving to the window to stare out at the sunlit grounds beyond. So peaceful, so at odds with the life and death decisions being weighed within these walls. My grandmother is 73, she said finally, her back still to Frank. She raised me after my mother died. My cousins have children of their own now, 2 little girls, a boy. She turned to face him. What would you do if it were your family? Frank met her gaze directly. I'd remember why I testified in the first place. What I was fighting for. Easy to say when it's not your loved ones at risk. You think I don't understand the cost? Frank's voice remained steady. I've watched witnesses walk away from everything. They knew everyone they loved because they believed justice mattered more than comfort or safety. I've seen some of them die because the system failed them. He stepped closer, the guards tensing but not intervening. But I've also seen what happens when good people stay silent. The cancer spreads, more families destroyed, more lives ended. Elena studied him, searching for something in his weathered face. You really believe we can win this, don't you? Even now, captured, outnumbered, with a corrupt system working against us. I believe it's worth fighting for, Frank replied simply. Beyond That we make our own odds. She nodded slowly, something resolving behind her eyes. Then we need a plan, because I'm not changing my testimony, and I'm not letting them kill you to punish me for it. A slight smile touched Frank's lips, the first since their capture. Now, you're thinking like a marshal. The rest of the day passed in careful conversation, both aware of the listening guards, both using the time to strengthen their resolve, while discreetly observing the compound's rhythms and routines. Meals were brought, surprisingly good, served on proper dinnerware. The pretense of hospitality maintained even as their captivity remained absolute. As evening approached, however, the charade ended. They were separated. Elena returned to what Frank assumed was guest quarters in the main house, while he was escorted back to his cell in the converted stables. "Enjoy your last night, Marshal," one guard taunted as the door closed. "Word is, if the witness doesn't play ball tomorrow, you're taking a permanent retirement." Alone again, Frank returned to the methodical assessment of his surroundings, searching for any weakness, any opportunity. The cell remained as secure as before, but one detail had changed. The tray from last night's meal had been removed, but a spoon had been left behind, partially concealed beneath the cot. Whether oversight or intentional assistance from Lucia, it represented the first tangible tool for potential escape. Frank retrieved the spoon, examining it carefully. Stainless steel, sturdy but not heavy-duty. Limited use as a weapon, but potentially valuable for other purposes. He concealed it in the mattress of the cot, then settled into wait for the compound to quiet for the night. Outside his cell, the guard rotation continued its predictable pattern. Through the small window, Frank observed the changing dynamics as night fell, fewer personnel visible, security focusing on perimeter control rather than internal movement. Around midnight, the same pattern as before. Footsteps approaching, lighter than the guards. The gentle sound of dishware. The viewing window slid open to reveal Lucia's face, more nervous than the previous night. "Marshal," she whispered. "I bring food." When the door opened enough for the tray, Frank noticed something else tucked beneath the napkin. A small key. "For your restraints," Lucia whispered, barely audible. "When the time comes." "Thank you," Frank replied softly. "What changed your mind?" Her expression hardened. "I heard them talking. If the witness refuses to cooperate, they will kill you both. Make examples." She glanced nervously down the corridor. "I cannot help more. The main gate is heavily guarded, but there is a service entrance near the kitchen. Less security." Before Frank could ask more questions, footsteps sounded in the distance. Lucia quickly closed the door, Thalox engaging as she hurried away. Frank concealed the key with the spoon, then ate the provided meal, mind working rapidly through the implications of this development. Lucia's assistance improved their chances, but escape still remained a desperate gambit. The compound was designed to prevent exactly such attempts, with professional security and multiple layers of protection. Yet every system had vulnerabilities, every security plan had blind spots, and Frank had spent a career exploiting precisely such weaknesses. As the compound settled into night's quiet rhythms, Frank lay on his cot, outwardly at rest but inwardly calculating, planning, preparing. Tomorrow would bring Ortiz back for Elena's answer. An answer Frank now knew with certainty would not be what the cartel leader wanted to hear, which meant tomorrow would also bring their last, best chance for escape, or their execution. Either way, the waiting was almost over. Dawn arrived with the sound of increased activity throughout the compound. Vehicles arriving, voices calling orders, the heightened energy of preparation. Through his cell window, Frank observed the security posture shifting, more personnel visible, weapons more prominently displayed, a palpable tension pervading the atmosphere. Today was decision day. Elena would give her answer to Ortiz's proposal, an answer that would determine both their fates. Frank had no doubt about what that answer would be. The resolve he'd seen in her eyes yesterday told him everything he needed to know. She would refuse to compromise her testimony, regardless of the consequences, a courage that filled him with both pride and dread. Pride in her unwavering commitment to justice, dread at what it would mean for both of them. The key and spoon remained, hidden in his mattress, small tools that might make the difference between life and death in the coming hours. Frank had spent much of the night formulating escape scenarios, calculating odds, preparing himself mentally and physically for what would likely be the most challenging extraction of his career. When the cell door opened around 8 o'clock, it wasn't the usual guards, but Michael Taggart who entered, dismissing the security detail with a gesture. "Give us a minute," he told them, closing the door partially, but not completely, maintaining security protocol even for a former marshal. Frank sat up on the cot, studying his one-time partner with measured assessment. Taggart looked tired, the strain of divided loyalties evident in the lines around his eyes, the tension in his posture. "Come to say goodbye?" Frank asked, tone deliberately neutral. Taggart leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Came to see if you'd talk some sense into the witness. She's being prepped for her meeting with Ortiz now. Word is, she's still planning to maintain her original testimony." "Her name is Elena Vasquez," Frank replied evenly. "And yes, she's planning to tell the truth. Novel concept in your new line of work, I imagine." A flash of anger crossed Taggart's face, quickly suppressed. "You always were a self-righteous son of a bitch, Frank. So quick to judge, so certain of your moral high ground." He shook his head. "You have no idea what it's like, watching someone you love suffer because you can't afford the treatment that might save them." "I'm sorry about Diane," Frank said, genuine sincerity in his voice. "But this isn't the answer, Mike. You know that. It's the only answer I had." Taggart straightened, checking his watch. "You've got maybe 2 hours before Ortiz returns for the witness's decision. If she doesn't cooperate..." He let the implication hang. "We both die," Frank finished for him. "Making quite a career change, aren't you? From protecting witnesses to executing them." Something flashed across Taggart's expression. Regret, perhaps, or some remnant of the man he had once been. "I'm not pulling the trigger, just holding the door open for those who will," Frank countered. "Same thing in my book." Taggart was silent for a moment. Internal conflict visible despite his attempt at professional detachment. "For what it's worth," he said finally, "this isn't what I signed up for either. Providing information on witness movements, helping intercept them before testimony. That was the arrangement. Not this." He gestured vaguely at the cell, at the situation they found themselves in. Frank leaned forward slightly. "Then do something about it, Mike. Help us." A bitter laugh escaped Taggart. "Little late for that, isn't it? I'm in too deep. They know about Diane, where she's receiving treatment. One phone call, and she loses access to the medications keeping her alive." He shook his head. "You made your choices based on principle, Frank. I made mine based on survival." "There's still time to make different choices," Frank pressed, sensing the fracture in Taggart's resolve. "Theman I knew, the partner I trusted. He's still in there somewhere. The man who became a marshal to protect people, not deliver them to executioners." Taggart's jaw tightened. "That man couldn't save his wife, but he could still save his soul," Frank replied quietly. "Help us, Mike. Not for me, for the badge we both wore, for what it's supposed to stand for." A long silence stretched between them, heavy with 3 decades of shared history, with the weight of decisions that had led them to opposite sides of an unbridgeable moral divide. Finally, Taggart straightened, his expression hardening back into professional detachment. "Goodbye, Frank," he said simply, turning toward the door. "Where's Tom?" Frank asked before he could leave. "Is he still alive?" Taggart paused, not turning around. "For now. He's being held at a different location. Insurance, in case Elena's family leverage isn't enough." "You were his friend," Frank reminded him. "His children call you uncle." Taggart's shoulders stiffened. Without responding, he exited the cell, the door closing firmly behind him. But in the brief moment before it shut, Frank caught something in his former partner's expression. A crack in the facade, a glimpse of the conflict raging beneath the surface. Not enough to count on as an ally, perhaps, but enough to suggest Taggart might not be an active impediment when the moment to act arrived. Left alone once more, Frank retrieved the key and spoon from their hiding place, concealing them in the waistband of his jeans, where they would be accessible despite his restraints. Then he settled in to wait, mentally reviewing the compound layout, security rotations, potential extraction routes. The 2 hours Taggart had mentioned passed with excruciating slowness. Frank used the time to prepare physically as well as mentally, stretching discreetly to maintain flexibility, conserving energy while ensuring his body was ready for the demands that would soon be placed upon it. Finally, approaching footsteps announced the next phase. The cell door opened to reveal 4 guards, more heavily armed than usual. "On your feet, Marshal," the lead guard ordered. "Boss wants to see you." Frank complied without resistance, allowing himself to be escorted from the cell back to the main house. The compound was on high alert now, security personnel positioned at strategic points throughout the grounds. Through windows, Frank glimpsed black SUVs parked in formation near the main entrance. Ortiz's entourage, prepared for rapid departure, if necessary. He was led to the same study as before, but the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Tension filled the air, the pretense of civilized negotiation replaced by the barely contained menace of men prepared for violence. Elena was already there, seated in the same chair as yesterday, her posture rigid with suppressed fear, but her expression composed. Their eyes met briefly as Frank was positioned opposite her, a silent communication of resolve and shared purpose. Ortiz entered moments later, his urbane demeanor unchanged despite the charged atmosphere. Victor Salazar accompanied him, along with 2 additional security personnel who took positions by the door. Michael Taggart followed, standing slightly apart, his expression carefully neutral. "Ms. Vasquez," Ortiz began without preamble, settling into his chair. "I trust you've had sufficient time to consider my proposal. What is your decision?" Eleanor's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, the only visible indication of her internal struggle. When she spoke, however, her voice was remarkably steady. "I've thought about everything you said," she began. "About my family, about protection, about what I may or may not have seen." She took a deep breath. "I can't change my testimony. I won't. What I witnessed was clear and unambiguous. Your operation is criminal. Your influence over Judge Vasquez is criminal. And I will testify to exactly what I saw, regardless of the consequences." The room went utterly still. Ortiz's expression didn't change, but something cold and reptilian entered his eyes, the look that had earned him the nickname El Serpiente. "I respect your courage, Ms. Vasquez," he said softly, "misguided though it may be." He turned to Frank. "And you, Marshal? Nothing to add? No last attempt to change her mind?" "She's made her decision," Frank replied simply. "The right one." Ortiz studied them both for a moment, then nodded slightly to Salazar. "Very well. We proceed with the alternative plan." He rose from his chair, straightening his immaculate suit. "You understand, of course, that neither of you can leave this property alive now. The only question remaining is how that end is achieved." Elena paled, but maintained her composure. "My testimony has already been recorded in detail. Killing me won't change that." "Perhaps not," Ortiz acknowledged, "but it will serve as a powerful deterrent to other potential witnesses. And it will give me personal satisfaction." He nodded to the guards. "Take them back to their detention area. Prepare them for transport to the secondary location for disposal. I don't want bodies on this property." The clinical detachment with which he discussed their execution sent a chill through the room. As guards moved forward to escort them out, Frank made his move. With a flexibility that belied his age, he managed to maneuver his restrained hands to retrieve the concealed key, working it into the lock of his restraints while maintaining a posture of defeated compliance. The moment was approaching. Not ideal, heavily outnumbered, but possibly their only opportunity. Frank caught Elena's eye, the slightest nod conveying his intent. She straightened almost imperceptibly, preparing herself. As the first guard reached for Frank's arm, the restraints fell, away concealed momentarily by his posture. In own fluid motion, honed by decades of hand-to-hand combat training, Frank struck, grabbing the guard's wrist and using his own momentum to slam him bodily into the second guard. Both men went down in a tangle of limbs and surprised shouts. Chaos erupted in the previously ordered room. Salazar reached for his weapon, but Frank was already moving, closing the distance between them with remarkable speed. A precise strike to Salazar's wrist sent the gun clattering across the floor, followed by an elbow to the solar plexus that doubled the man over. Elena, despite her lack of combat training, responded with impressive presence of mind. As attention focused on Frank's sudden attack, she drove her elbow hard into the face of the guard reaching for her, then scrambled toward the fallen weapon. Ortiz was backing toward the door, shouting orders as his security detail moved to intercept Frank. Through the confusion, Frank registered Taggart's position, still by the door, weapon drawn but not firing, expression torn between professional duty and personal conflict. Taggart! Frank called out as he grappled with one of the security men. Make your choice! For one suspended moment, the former partners locked eyes across the chaotic room, a silent communication laden with 3 decades of shared history, of trust built and betrayed, of paths diverged. Then, to Frank's surprise and gratitude, Taggart made his choice. He swung his weapon toward Ortiz's remaining bodyguard, barking out, "Federal Marshal, stand down!" The momentary confusion his intervention created was all Frank needed. He dispatched his opponent with a practiced combination of strikes, then moved to secure Salazar, who was attempting to regain his feet. Elena had retrieved the fallen gun, but held it awkwardly, clearly unfamiliar with firearms despite Frank's basic training. Her eyes were wide with adrenaline and fear, but she maintained enough presence of mind to keep the weapon trained in Ortiz's general direction. "Secure the door," Frank ordered Taggart, who complied without hesitation, moving to lock them in and prevent additional security from entering. Ortiz, remarkably, maintained his composure despite the sudden reversal. "Impressive, Marshal," he acknowledged with the detached admiration of a chess player recognizing a skilled move. "But ultimately futile. This compound has over 20 armed security personnel. The perimeter is sealed. You've merely delayed the highway. Inevitable." "Maybe," Frank agreed, retrieving zip ties from a fallen guard to secure Salazar. "But sometimes, a delay is all you need." He turned to Taggart. "Where's the nearest vehicle we can take?" "Service entrance near the kitchen," Taggart replied, the same location Lucia had mentioned. 2 SUVs kept there for staff use, keys in the vehicles. He checked his watch. "Guard rotation in 3 minutes. Brief window where the southeast corner." "We'll have minimal coverage," Frank nodded, moving to secure the remaining unconscious guards while keeping Ortiz covered. "Communications. Radio network. Channel 6. All security personnel monitor it." "Perfect," Frank said grimly, collecting a radio from one of the restrained men. "Elena, keep that weapon on Ortiz. Don't hesitate to use it if he moves." She nodded, adjusting her grip to the proper stance Frank had taught her during their brief training sessions. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes were steady, focused. "What's the play here, Frank?" Taggart asked, keeping watch through the door's viewing panel. "Even if we make it to a vehicle, the gates will be locked down the moment they realize what's happening." "Then we don't use the gates," Frank replied, moving to the window to assess the grounds outside. "Every compound has maintenance access, service routes, drainage channels, utility corridors, something not on the main security grid." Taggart looked surprised. "Southeast corner. Maintenance access for the septic system. Heavy grate, but not electronically. Monitored." He glanced at Ortiz, who remained impassively seated despite being a prisoner in his own study. "It'll be a tight fit, though." "We'll manage." Frank turned to Elena. "Ready to move?" She nodded, determination overriding fear in her expression. "What about him?" She gestured toward Ortiz with the gun. "He's coming with us," Frank decided. "Insurance, policy." Ortiz's eyebrows rose slightly. "A hostage situation, Marshal. Rather beneath your professional standards, isn't it?" "Consider it protective custody," Frank replied without humor. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, kidnapping of a federal witness, and attempted murder. You have the right to remain silent." A cold smile touched Ortiz's lips. "Always the lawman. Even now." Frank secured Ortiz's hands behind his back. Then addressed Taggart. "What about Tom? Where exactly is he being held?" "Processing facility outside Eagle Pass," Taggart answered, guilt flashing across his features. "Old meatpacking plant. 3 men guarding him, rotating shifts." Frank processed this information rapidly, adjusting plans accordingly. "We'll need to contact the Marshal's office once we're clear. Someone Tom trusts implicitly." He caught Taggart's gaze. "You coming with us? Because once we leave this room, there's no middle ground anymore." A moment of hesitation. Then Taggart nodded. "I'm in. Too late to go back anyway." He checked the corridor again. "Guard rotation starting. We need to move now." Frank took charge. Years of tactical operations, experience guiding his decisions. "Taggart, you lead with Ortiz. I'll take rear position. Elena, stay between us. If we encounter resistance, hit the floor immediately. Understand?" Elena nodded, her earlier training evident in her focus despite the chaos. Frank handed her the key to hair restraints, which she quickly used to free herself. 3, 2, 1, move! Frank commanded. They exited the study in tight formation, Taggart leading with Ortiz held firmly before him as a shield. Frank bringing up the rear with a confiscated weapon. The corridor was momentarily clear, security personnel focused. On the guard rotation taking place outside, kitchen access is through the dining room, then left. Taggart directed in a low voice, maintaining a brisk but controlled pace. They moved through the hacienda's interior like a well-coordinated unit, each person understanding their role, maintaining discipline despite the suffocating tension. When they encountered a staff member, a young woman carrying linens, Frank silenced her with a quick gesture before she could raise alarm. Her wide eyes suggested she might be sympathetic to their escape, or at least unwilling to risk her safety to prevent it. The kitchen was mercifully empty, the morning meal preparation completed, lunch preparations not yet begun. Through its rear windows, Frank could see the service area Taggart had mentioned. 2 black SUVs parked near a loading dock, minimal security presence during the rotation. 30 seconds until the next patrol passes, Taggart warned, checking his watch. Then we have a 2-minute window. Frank used the brief delay to reinforce instructions. Once we're outside, move directly to the nearest vehicle. No hesitation, no stopping regardless of what happens. Elena, stay low and close to me. Taggart, you drive. The seconds ticked by with excruciating slowness. Each heartbeat a thunderous reminder of what was at stake. Finally, Taggart nodded. Clear. Now. They burst through the kitchen's service door onto the loading dock, maintaining tight formation as they descended the short steps to the parking area. The nearest SUV was approximately 30 yards away, an exposed approach that left them vulnerable but unavoidable. Their movement immediately triggered a shout from across the compound, a guard spotting them despite their rotation. Within seconds, the radio on Frank's belt erupted with urgent communications. Security personnel alerted to the escape attempt. Run! Frank ordered, all pretense of stealth abandoned as gunfire erupted from the direction of the main gate. Bullets pinged off metal and concrete around them as they sprinted toward the vehicle. Taggart dragging a surprisingly compliant Ortiz. Elena showing remarkable speed despite her injured ankle. They reached the SUV moments before the full security force could respond, piling in with practiced urgency. Taggart behind the wheel with Ortiz in the passenger seat, Frank and Elena in the rear. The vehicle roared to life, tires spinning on gravel as Taggart accelerated toward the southeast corner of the compound. Gate's closing, Elena called out, spotting the electronic gates beginning their inexorable movement at the main entrance. Not going that way, Taggart replied grimly, steering the SUV directly toward a seemingly solid section of the perimeter wall, near a utility shed. Service access is behind that shed. Brace yourselves. The SUV crashed through a section of light fencing concealed by landscaping, revealing a narrow maintenance corridor running alongside the main wall. Gunfire continued behind them, security vehicles now in pursuit, but the tight confines of the service corridor prevented effective pursuit by multiple vehicles. Drain access 40 yards ahead, Taggart called out, navigating the corridor with the precision of someone intimately familiar with the property layout. We'll have to leave the vehicle, go through on foot. Then what? Elena asked, her voice remarkably steady despite the chaos. There's a maintenance road on the other side, Taggart explained, bringing the SUV to a halt beside a large grate secured with a heavy padlock. Connects to a county road about half a mile east. Rarely used, minimal security. Frank was already moving, using the butt of his weapon to break the padlock. The grate swung open to reveal a concrete drainage channel approximately 4 feet in diameter, large enough to traverse on hands and knees, but barely. Ortiz first, Frank ordered. Then Elena, Taggart, me. Ortiz regarded the dirty drainage pipe with distaste. You expect me to crawl through that? Your choice, Frank replied evenly. Pipe or stay here and explain to your men how you let 2 federal witnesses escape. That logic apparently penetrated even Ortiz's arrogance. With as much dignity as the situation allowed, he lowered himself to the opening and began crawling into the dark passage. Elena followed immediately, adapting to the difficult movement with grim determination. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. Vehicles approaching, shouted orders, the crack of gunfire getting closer. Go, Frank instructed Taggart, who hesitated momentarily. What about you? Right behind you. Someone needs to cover the rear. Taggart nodded in understanding, then ducked into the passage. Frank took position behind the SUV, using it as cover to lay down suppressing fire as the first security vehicle rounded the corner into the service corridor. His precise shots took out the lead vehicle's tires, causing it to swerve and temporarily block the narrow passage. With the pursuit momentarily delayed, Frank retreated to the drainage access, pausing only to drag the heavy grate partially closed behind him before entering the confined space. The passage was dark, damp, and oppressively close, concrete walls brushing shoulders on either side, the ceiling low enough to prevent anything other than a hunched crawl. The smell of stagnant water and mold filled the confined space, making each breath unpleasant. Frank moved as quickly as the restrictive conditions allowed, following the sounds of movement ahead. After what felt like an eternity but was likely less than 2 minutes, he began to see light, the exit point ahead where Taggart, Elena, and Ortiz had already emerged. As Frank neared the opening, a hand reached back in, Elena helping to pull him out into the sunlight. He emerged onto a scrubby slope overlooking a dirt road, the perimeter wall of Ortiz's compound barely visible in the distance behind them. Maintenance vehicle, Taggart explained, already moving toward an old pickup truck parked near a utility pole. Used by the electrical contractors. Keys should be... He reached under the driver's side wheel, producing a magnetic key holder. Right here. The truck started on the first try, its engine significantly less powerful than the SUV they'd abandoned but functional. Frank secured, Ortiz in the cargo bed with Eleanor keeping watch over him while he joined Taggart in the cab. County Road 227 is about a mile east, Taggart said as they bumped along the rough maintenance track. From there, we can reach Highway 83 and head north. They'll have alerted all local law enforcement, Frank pointed out. Standard procedure would be to establish roadblocks on all major arteries. Taggart nodded grimly. Which is why we don't take major arteries. There's a network of ranch roads that parallel the highway, rough going, but passable. I used them for fugitive tracking back in the day. Frank studied his former partner, the familiar tactical thinking a jarring contrast to his recent betrayal. Why, Mike? Why help us now? Taggart kept his eyes on the difficult terrain ahead, hands tight on the steering wheel. Maybe something you said got through. Maybe I'm tired of looking in the mirror and not recognizing who I've become. A humorless smile touched his lips. Or maybe I just realized I'd backed the wrong horse. Ortiz loses this round, I'd be the next loose end they'd tie up. Practical self-preservation more than moral awakening. Frank could accept that. It aligned with the man Taggart had revealed himself to be. They reached County Road 227 without signs of immediate pursuit, though Frank harbored no illusions about the resources being mobilized against them. Ortiz controlled significant portions of local law enforcement through bribes and intimidation. Every patrol car in a 100-mile radius would be looking for them. Head north, Frank instructed. We need to get Elena to federal protection. Someone, outside the normal channels. Someone we're certain isn't compromised. I might know someone, Taggart offered. Regional Director Phillips in the Houston office. He's old school, incorruptible. No connection to the San Antonio operation or anyone involved in Elena's case. Frank considered this. Can you contact him securely? Not from here. We'd need to reach a landline that can't be traced to us. Taggart glanced in the rearview mirror at their high-value prisoner in the truck bed. Having Ortiz in custody changes everything. His testimony could bring down not just Judge Vasquez, but the entire network. Assuming he talks, Frank replied skeptically. He'll talk. Taggart's expression hardened. Men like Ortiz always make deals to save themselves. Honor among thieves is a myth. As if on cue, the radio clipped to Frank's belt, confiscated from one of the guards, crackled to life. All units, this is control. Primary target has been acquired by hostile forces. Initiate Protocol Black. Repeat, Protocol Black is now active. Frank and Taggart exchanged grim looks. Protocol Black. Neither needed to ask what that meant in cartel terminology. Scorched earth. No witnesses. Full resources deployed. They're not just looking to recapture Ortiz now, Taggart said quietly. They're looking to eliminate him before he can talk. Cut off the head to save the body. Frank nodded. His own organization has now marked him for death, which means we're not just running from Ortiz's men anymore. Elena finished from the truck bed, where she'd been listening. We're running from everyone who works for him, everyone who's ever taken his money, and they don't care if he dies in the process. The situation had escalated beyond a simple escape. They were now caught between Ortiz's forces, trying to eliminate him and law enforcement, much of it potentially corrupted, trying to apprehend them all. Frank made a rapid strategic assessment. We need to go dark completely. No phones, no credit cards, nothing that leaves a digital footprint. I know a place, Taggart offered. Old hunting cabin about 40 miles north of here. Belonged to my uncle, not connected to me on any official records. Isolated, defensible. Frank weighed their options, which were admittedly limited. How long to get there? On these back roads? 3 hours, maybe 4. Do it, Frank decided. We'll regroup there, establish contact with Phillips, arrange secure transport for both Alina and Ortiz. As Taggart navigated the labyrinthine network of ranch roads and forgotten county routes, Frank maintained vigilant watch for pursuit. The truck's inadequate suspension turned every rut and pothole into a bone-jarring impact. But the discomfort was irrelevant compared to the alternative. In the cargo bed, Elena kept steady watch over Ortiz, who had maintained a composed silence since their escape. The cartel leader's calculating eyes suggested he was already assessing new angles, identifying potential advantages in his dramatically altered circumstances. He's planning something, Elena observed quietly when Frank checked on them during a brief stop to confirm their route. Always, Frank agreed. Men like him don't surrender mentally, even when physically captured. Keep your distance. Don't engage in conversation. She nodded, the gun steady in her hand despite hours of tense vigilance. I've been thinking about what happens after we get to safety. The trial, the testimony. One step at a time, Frank cautioned. First priority is keeping you alive to testify. And you? She asked, searching his weathered face. What's your priority in all this? Frank considered the question with the honesty it deserved. Started as doing my job, protecting a witness. Now, he glanced at Ortiz, then back to Elena. Now it's about finishing what we started, seeing justice done all the way through. The personal nature of the mission didn't need explicit acknowledgement. They had both crossed a line where professional detachment was no longer possible. Too much bloodshed, too many betrayals revealed, too much at stake. The journey continued through increasingly remote terrain, the Texas landscape shifting from scrubland to denser vegetation as they moved northward. Twice, they altered course to avoid local sheriff's vehicles spotted in the distance, each deviation adding time to their journey but maintaining their crucial anonymity. By late afternoon, exhaustion was taking its toll on all of them. Taggart's hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel, his focus narrowing with fatigue. Eleanor's vigilance over Ortiz had become mechanical, her injured ankle clearly causing significant pain, though she refused to complain. Frank himself felt the cumulative effects of multiple days with minimal rest, his body reminding him with increasing insistence that 65 was not 35, regardless of training or determination. When they finally reached the turnoff for the hunting cabin, little more than a dirt track disappearing into dense woods, the sun was already low in the western sky, casting long shadows across the landscape. Half a mile up this track, Taggart directed, navigating the deeply rutted path with care. No electricity, but there's a generator if needed. Spring-fed well for water. Basic, but functional. The cabin materialized from the gathering dusk, a simple structure of weathered logs with a small porch and shuttered windows. Isolated, defensible, and most importantly, untraceable to any of them through official channels. Frank conducted a perimeter check while Taggart secured Ortiz inside, confirming the isolation Taggart had promised. No neighbors within visual or audible range, a single approach road easily monitored, natural features that could serve as defensive positions if needed. Inside, the cabin was indeed basic. 2 small bedrooms, a main living area with fireplace, rudimentary kitchen facilities, and an enclosed porch that had been converted to additional sleeping space. Musty from disuse, but structurally sound and reasonably clean. Not the Ritz. Frank echoed his comment from the abandoned church, earning a tired smile from Elena. Looks like paradise to me right now, she replied, sinking gratefully onto a worn sofa, the weight of the day's events evident in the slump of her shoulders. Taggart had secured Ortiz to a sturdy chair in the main room, the cartel leader's composed demeanor finally showing cracks as the reality of his situation settled in. For a man accustomed to absolute control, to being surrounded by the trappings of wealth and power, the rustic cabin represented a profound fall from grace. What now, Marshal? Ortiz asked, breaking his long silence. You must realize your position remains untenable. My organization has resources beyond your comprehension. Men in every level of government, every branch of law enforcement. Maybe, Frank acknowledged, checking the cabin's supplies for anything useful. But organizations like yours have a critical weakness, Ortiz. They're built on fear and greed, not loyalty. The moment you appeared vulnerable, your own people activated a kill order. He gestured to the radio still clipped to his belt. Protocol Black, wasn't it? No one's coming to rescue you. They're coming to silence you. A flicker of something, perhaps genuine concern, crossed Ortiz's features before his mask of control reasserted itself. All the more reason to consider a mutually beneficial arrangement, Marshal. I have information that would be extremely valuable to federal prosecutors. Names, dates, financial records. Enough to dismantle not just my operation, but competing organizations across 3 states. Turning states' evidence? Frank raised an eyebrow. Quite a change of heart for El Serpiente. Adaptation is survival, Ortiz replied simply. The game has changed. I adjust accordingly. Frank studied him with the experienced assessment of a man who had interviewed countless criminals over decades of service. We'll see what the prosecution has to say about that. For now, you're simply a prisoner. As night fell completely, they established a security rotation, Frank taking first watch, then Taggart, with Elena allowed to rest, given her injured ankle and the toll of the day's events. Simple meals were prepared from the cabin's stock of non-perishable supplies. Water drawn from the well Taggart had mentioned. During his watch, seated near the window with clear sightlines to the approach road, Frank found himself reflecting on the extraordinary arc of events that had brought them to this moment. From quiet retirement on Sycamore Lane to a desperate flight with a cartel leader as prisoner, all in less than 2 weeks. The familiar weight of responsibility settled across his shoulders, not just for Elena's safety now, but for the broader implications of what they had uncovered. Judge Vasquez's corruption, the network of law enforcement officials compromised by cartel money, the systemic failures that had allowed such cancer to grow unchecked. Frank Castillo had spent a career upholding justice within a system he believed in, despite its imperfections. Now that very system had been revealed as corrupted at fundamental levels. The betrayal was not just Taggart's personal failure, but an institutional one that struck at the core of Frank's life's work. Yet somehow, the revelation had not broken his resolve, but hardened it. If the system could be corrupted, it could also be cleansed, but only by those willing to stand firm when standing was hardest. His contemplation was interrupted by Elena's voice, soft in the darkness, as she emerged from the bedroom where she'd been resting. Couldn't sleep, she explained, moving to sit across from him. Too much adrenaline still in my system, I guess. Frank nodded in understanding. Common after intense situations. Body takes time to reset. She studied him in the faint moonlight filtering through the window. How are you so calm? After everything that's happened, betrayal, capture, that insane escape, you seem centered. Experience, Frank replied simply. When you've seen enough life or death situations, you develop perspective. Panic doesn't help, so you learn to control it. Is that why you became a marshal? For the adrenaline? Frank considered the question, realizing no one had asked him that in years. No, he answered, truthfully. I became a marshal because I believed in the idea that no one is above the law. That justice matters, even when, especially when, it's difficult to achieve. He glanced toward Ortiz, sleeping under guard in the main room. Still believe that? Despite everything? Eleanor nodded slowly. After my father was killed, I promised myself I'd never get involved in anything dangerous. Just keep my head down, live quietly. A rueful smile touched her lips. So much for that plan. Some choices find us, Frank observed. You could have walked away when you saw what was happening at that counting house. Many would have. You didn't. Neither did you, she countered. When things got dangerous, you could have handed me off to the marshals, gone back to your retirement. Some choices find us, Frank repeated, the simple phrase encompassing the unexpected journey that had brought them to this remote cabin. Fugitives and captors all at once. The night deepened around them, the Texas wilderness alive with subtle sounds, distant owl calls, the rustle of nighttime creatures, the whisper of wind through pine needles. Within the cabin, 4 people connected by circumstance and choice awaited the dawn and whatever it might bring. For Frank Castillo, the path forward was clear, if not easy. Get Elena and Ortiz to federal authorities they could trust, ensure justice was served, expose the corruption that had infected the system he had served faithfully for decades. Simple objectives. nearly impossible execution, but Frank had built a career on achieving exactly such improbable outcomes. The hunt continued, roles reversed once more, with higher stakes than ever before. Dawn broke through the cabin windows in pale streams of amber light, illuminating dust, motes dancing in the still air. Frank, who had taken the final watch after relieving Taggart at 4 a.m., observed the awakening forest with tactical assessment. The single access road remained clear, no sign of pursuit yet visible, a temporary reprieve. He knew wouldn't last. The others stirred gradually. Elena emerged from the small bedroom first, her injured ankle noticeably improved after a night's rest, though dark circles beneath her eyes testified to troubled sleep. Taggart followed shortly after, moving with the stiffness of a man whose body was protesting recent exertions. Ortiz remained secured to his chair in the main room, somehow managing to look imperious, despite his circumstances. "Nothing?" Taggart asked, joining Frank at the window. Frank shook his head. "Clear so far. Won't stay that way." They gathered around the cabin's small table, a map of the surrounding area spread before them. Basic provisions served as breakfast: canned fruit, beef jerky, bottled water, while they assessed their increasingly limited options. "We need to contact Director Phillips," Taggart insisted. "Get federal resources deployed, proper custody for Ortiz, protective detail for Elena." "Agreed," Frank replied. "But we can't use cell phones, too easily tracked, and we can't risk entering a town to use a landline. Too many eyes looking for us now." Eleanor, who had been quietly contemplating the map, looked up. "What about the ranger station?" She pointed to a marking approximately 7 miles northeast of their location. "They'd have communications, might be isolated enough to approach safely." Frank studied the location with growing interest. Good thinking. Remote enough to avoid immediate detection, official enough to have secure communications. He glanced at Taggart. "What do you know about it?" "Skeletal staff this time of year," Taggart replied after brief consideration. "Maybe 2 rangers on rotation, basic facilities, emergency radio system that could reach state authorities." He traced the route on the map. Rough terrain between here and there, but passable in the truck. "We'd be exposed approaching," Frank noted. "And we don't know if ranger stations have been alerted to watch for us." "Less risk than alternatives," Taggart countered. "And time isn't on our side. Ortiz's organization will have mobilized every resource available. They're probably already establishing search patterns, checking locations like this." From his position across the room, Ortiz broke his silence. "He's right, Marshal. My security chief, Salazar, will have activated contingency protocols immediately. Thermal imaging drones, communications interception, local assets, a methodical grid search of the region is standard procedure." All eyes turned to the cartel leader, whose calculated cooperation suggested he'd been reassessing his position throughout the night. "Why tell us this?" Frank asked, studying him with practiced skepticism. A thin smile touched Ortiz's lips. "Self-preservation, Marshal. As you so astutely observed, my organization has issued a termination order. My survival now depends entirely on reaching federal custody, preferably with multiple witnesses to prevent any unfortunate accidents during processing." He shifted slightly in his restraints. "I'm now more valuable to you alive than dead, and significantly more valuable to myself that way as well." Frank exchanged glances with Elena and Taggart, all recognizing the pragmatic truth in Ortiz's assessment. The cartel leaders' cooperation improved their chances, even if motivated purely by self-interest. The ranger station then, Frank decided. "We move in 1 hour, minimal equipment, maximum mobility." He turned to Taggart. "How much fuel in the truck?" "Quarter tank. Enough to reach the station, not much beyond that." Frank nodded, mentally calculating contingencies. "Elena stays with me at all times. Taggart, you handle Ortiz. Any sign of trouble, any hint of betrayal?" His gaze locked with his former partner's. "I won't hesitate." Taggart held his gaze steadily. "Understood." As they prepared for departure, gathering the few useful supplies from the cabin, Frank pulled Eleanor aside for a private word. "Whatever happens at the ranger station, your testimony remains the priority. If things go wrong, if we get separated, your job is to reach federal authorities and tell them everything about Ortiz, about Judge Vasquez, about the corruption." She studied him with concern. "You make it sound like you're not expecting to make it." "Always plan for worst-case scenarios," Frank replied simply. increases the chances of better outcomes. Elena's expression hardened with resolve. We all make it, or none of us do. That's my plan. Frank recognized the stubborn determination in her eyes, the same quality that had led her to testify against the cartel in the first place. He didn't argue further, respecting both her courage and her right to make her own choices, however dangerous. The truck was loaded within the hour, minimal supplies, weapons distributed according to experience and need. Frank conducted a final perimeter check while Taggart secured Ortiz in the cargo bed. The cartel leader's restraints adjusted to allow limited movement without offering opportunity for escape. As they prepared to depart, Frank noticed Elena standing at the edge of the clearing, gazing back at the cabin with an unreadable expression. Second thoughts? He asked, joining her. She shook her head. Just thinking about how quickly life can change. 2 weeks ago, I was just a cleaning woman trying to make ends meet. Now, she gestured vaguely at their situation. Now you're making history, Frank finished for her. Most people go their whole lives without making the kind of difference you're about to make. If we survive, she added with grim humor. When, Frank corrected. When we survive. The journey to the ranger station began in tense silence, the truck navigating increasingly difficult terrain as they avoided established roads. Frank maintained vigilant watch from the passenger seat while Taggart drove, both men scanning constantly for signs of pursuit or surveillance. In the cargo bed, Eleanor maintained her guard over Ortiz, who had lapsed into contemplative silence. The cartel leader's cooperation remained a calculated decision rather than a moral awakening. But for the moment, his interests aligned with theirs, a temporary alliance born of mutual necessity. They had covered perhaps 3 miles when the distant sound of helicopter rotors drifted across the landscape. Frank immediately signaled Taggart to stop, the vehicle pulling into the cover of dense trees, just as a black helicopter appeared on the horizon to the south. Not Park Service, Taggart confirmed grimly, observing the aircraft through binoculars. No markings, military grade. Has to be cartel. Frank watched the helicopter's search pattern with professional assessment. Systematic grid search, just like Ortiz said. They're working methodically north from the compound. How long until they reach this area? Eleanor asked from the cargo bed. Hours, not days, Frank replied honestly. They'll have ground teams coordinating with air surveillance. Watch for us. Less risk than alternatives, Taggart countered. And time isn't on our side. Ortiz's organization will have mobilized every resource available. They're probably already establishing search patterns, checking locations like this. From his position across the room, Ortiz broke his silence. He's right, Marshal. My security chief, Salazar, will have activated contingency protocols immediately. Thermal imaging drones, communications interception, local assets, a methodical grid search of the region is standard procedure. All eyes turned to the cartel leader, whose calculated cooperation suggested he'd been reassessing his position throughout the night. Why tell us this? Frank asked, studying him with practiced skepticism. A thin smile touched Ortiz's lips. Self-preservation, Marshal. As you so astutely observed, my organization has issued a termination order. My survival now depends entirely on reaching federal custody, preferably with multiple witnesses to prevent any unfortunate accidents during processing. He shifted slightly in his restraints. I'm now more valuable to you alive than dead, and significantly more valuable to myself that way as well. Frank exchanged glances with Elena and Taggart, all recognizing the pragmatic truth in Ortiz's assessment. The cartel leader's cooperation improved their chances, even if motivated purely by self-interest. The ranger station then, Frank decided. We move in 1 hour, minimal equipment, maximum mobility. He turned to Taggart. How much fuel in the truck? 1/4 tank. Enough to reach the station, not much beyond that. Frank nodded, mentally calculating contingencies. Elena stays with me at all times. Taggart, you handle Ortiz. Any sign of trouble, any hint of betrayal. His gaze locked with his former partners. I won't hesitate. Taggart held his gaze steadily. Understood. As they prepared for departure, gathering the few useful supplies from the cabin, Frank pulled Eleanor aside for a private word. Whatever happens at the ranger station, your testimony remains the priority. If things go wrong, if we get separated, your job is to reach federal authorities and tell them everything about Ortiz, about Judge Vasquez, about the corruption. She studied him with concern. You make it sound like you're not expecting to make it. Always plan for worst-case scenarios, Frank replied simply. Increases the chances of better outcomes. Elena's expression hardened with resolve. We all make it, or none of us do. That's my plan. Frank recognized the stubborn determination in her eyes, the same quality that had led her to testify against the cartel in the first place. He didn't argue further, respecting both her courage and her right to make her own choices, however dangerous. The truck was loaded within the hour, minimal supplies, weapons distributed according to experience and need. Frank conducted a final perimeter check while Taggart secured Ortiz in the cargo bed. The cartel leader's restraints adjusted to allow limited movement without offering opportunity for escape. As they prepared to depart, Frank noticed Elena standing at the edge of the clearing, gazing back at the cabin with an unreadable expression. Second thoughts? He asked, joining her. She shook her head. Just thinking about how quickly life can change. 2 weeks ago, I was just a cleaning woman trying to make ends meet. Now, she gestured vaguely at their situation. Now you're making history, Frank finished for her. Most people go their whole lives without making the kind of difference you're about to make. If we survive, she added with grim humor. When, Frank corrected. When we survive. The journey to the ranger station began in tense silence, the truck navigating increasingly difficult terrain as they avoided established roads. Frank maintained vigilant watch from the passenger seat while Taggart drove, both men scanning constantly for signs of pursuit or surveillance. In the cargo bed, Eleanor maintained her guard over Ortiz, who had lapsed into contemplative silence. The cartel leader's cooperation remained a calculated decision rather than a moral awakening. But for the moment, his interests aligned with theirs, a temporary alliance born of mutual necessity. They had covered perhaps 3 miles when the distant sound of helicopter rotors drifted across the landscape. Frank immediately signaled Taggart to stop, the vehicle pulling into the cover of dense trees, just as a black helicopter appeared on the horizon to the south. Not Park Service, Taggart confirmed grimly, observing the aircraft through binoculars. No markings, military grade. Has to be cartel. Frank watched the helicopter's search pattern with professional assessment. Systematic grid search, just like Ortiz said. They're working methodically north from the compound. How long until they reach this area? Eleanor asked from the cargo bed. Hours, not days, Frank replied honestly. They'll have ground teams coordinating with air surveillance,